For most of human history, the feeling of hunger was not a problem waiting to be solved. It was the normal condition of being alive. Long before supermarkets, long before farms, and long before regular meals, the human body learned to move, think, and survive, while never fully certain when the next food would appear. Hunger shaped our senses, our patience, and even the slow rhythm of how our ancestors crossed landscapes in search of plants, roots, insects, and animals that could disappear with the seasons. In that distant world, the body that now sits comfortably in a modern kitchen was built for a very different environment, one where satisfaction was temporary and uncertainty was constant. If that is true, then a quiet question begins to appear. Why does the human body still behave as if food might disappear tomorrow? And if the past was shaped by scarcity rather than abundance, what does that reveal about a deeper mystery? Why humans were always hungry? For most of the time that humans have existed, the search for food shaped nearly every movement of daily life. Long before written history, before cities, and long before the idea of 3 meals appearing at predictable hours, human beings lived within landscapes where food appeared unevenly and often disappeared just as quickly. The forests, grasslands, and river valleys where early humans lived were rich in life, but that richness did not mean stability. Plants ripened at certain times and then vanished for months. Herds of animals moved across wide territories and could not always be found when people needed them. Even in environments that seemed abundant, the experience of food was rarely permanent. Instead, it arrived in moments, in seasons, and sometimes in brief opportunities that required patience and careful observation. In such a world, hunger was not an unusual event that signaled danger or failure. It was simply part of the background rhythm of life, something the body expected and understood. When anthropologists study modern hunter-gatherer communities, they often observe that food gathering and hunting form the central structure of the day. People move across the land, looking for signs that plants have ripened or that animals have passed through recently. The work is attentive and slow, guided by knowledge of landscapes that has been passed from one generation to the next. Yet even with deep knowledge of the environment, success is never completely guaranteed. Some days provide more food than expected, while other days provide little at all. These variations do not necessarily lead to crisis, because human groups developed social systems that helped manage uncertainty, including sharing food within the group. But the presence of sharing does not remove the deeper ecological reality that food availability has always fluctuated. The body itself carries traces of this long relationship with uncertainty. Human metabolism is flexible in ways that allow the body to function even when energy intake varies from day to day. When food becomes available, the body can store energy for later use. When food becomes scarce, the body can draw on those stored reserves. These physiological patterns are widely understood as adaptations that developed across long periods of human evolution. They reflect an environment where the timing of meals was not controlled by clocks or schedules, but by the unpredictable patterns of ecosystems. Archaeological evidence also suggests that early human diets were diverse and variable. Remains of animal bones with cut marks, residues from plants on stone tools, and microscopic traces preserved in ancient teeth all indicate that human ancestors relied on many different food sources depending on the region and season. No single food defined the human diet across all landscapes. Instead, the ability to eat a wide range of plants and animals became one of the defining characteristics of the species. This flexibility allowed humans to survive in many environments, from wooded valleys to open savannas, but it also meant that food resources could shift quickly when weather, migration patterns, or ecological changes altered the landscape. Because of this, the experience of hunger cannot be understood simply as a failure to find food. In the deeper history of humanity, it functioned more like a signal that guided movement and attention. Hunger encouraged people to search, to explore new areas, and to remember where food had been found before. Over thousands of generations, the relationship between the human body and the environment became shaped by these cycles of searching and finding. When viewed from the perspective of modern life, where food can appear with little effort, this earlier world can seem distant and unfamiliar. Yet the biological systems that evolved during that long history remain present in every human body today. The quiet sensation of hunger that appears between meals may feel ordinary, but it carries echoes of a time when finding the next source of nourishment required patience, cooperation, and careful awareness of the land. In that older world, hunger was not simply an absence of food. It was part of the landscape of being human, a signal that connected the body to the wider rhythms of nature, and a reminder that survival depended on understanding a world where certainty was rare and opportunity could never be fully predicted. Across many landscapes where early humans lived, the search for food was not a brief task placed between other activities. It was the activity around which most other actions were organized. Movement through the environment was guided by memory, experience, and careful attention to small signs that revealed where nourishment might be found. A cluster of trees beginning to produce fruit, the tracks of animals pressed into soft soil, or the presence of certain insects could all signal that food might be nearby. These clues formed a quiet language of the land, one that people learned gradually as they grew older within their communities. Yet even with deep familiarity, the natural world rarely offered certainty. Rainfall patterns could change, animal herds could shift their routes, and plants that produced food one season might produce little in another. Because of this, daily life often involved long periods of searching that did not immediately lead to eating. In many cases, people might walk considerable distances before encountering food that could be gathered or hunted. Anthropological studies of foraging societies in different parts of the world have shown that the process of obtaining food often unfolds slowly across the day, involving travel, observation, and cooperation among members of the group. Some individuals may focus on collecting plant foods such as fruits, seeds, or roots, while others may attempt to locate animals. The outcome of these efforts varies widely. Sometimes a group returns with abundant resources, and other times with very little. This uneven pattern does not necessarily mean that people were constantly starving, but it does suggest that the timing of eating was closely tied to the opportunities offered by the environment, rather than by a fixed schedule. The body gradually adapted to this rhythm. Instead of expecting nourishment at regular intervals, human physiology became capable of functioning through fluctuating periods of intake. Energy gathered during one successful search could support activity during a quieter period when little was found. This pattern can be observed in the way the body stores energy in the form of fat, which acts as a reserve that can be drawn upon later. Such mechanisms allowed early humans to remain active even when food was temporarily scarce. Over long stretches of evolutionary time, these biological responses helped stabilize life in environments where uncertainty was normal. Archaeological discoveries reinforce this picture of a flexible and opportunistic relationship with food. Stone tools recovered from ancient sites often carry microscopic traces of plant materials, while bones of animals found nearby show marks created by cutting tools. These findings suggest that early humans made use of a wide variety of foods depending on what was available in the surrounding landscape. Instead of relying on a single, dependable resource, they developed strategies that allowed them to switch between different foods as conditions changed. This adaptability helped human groups spread across diverse regions of the world, from temperate woodlands to more open and arid environments. Yet the same adaptability also meant that the experience of eating remained closely tied to chance and circumstance. A successful day of gathering or hunting might provide nourishment for many people at once, but it could not guarantee that the following day would unfold in the same way. Over generations, communities developed knowledge systems that helped them anticipate where food might appear during different seasons. Elders remembered the timing of flowering plants, the migration of animals, and the locations of water sources that attracted wildlife. This knowledge allowed groups to move through the landscape in ways that improved their chances of finding nourishment. Even so, the underlying unpredictability of ecosystems remained. Food was something that had to be continually rediscovered, rather than something that simply waited in a permanent place. In this setting, hunger functioned as a quiet guide rather than a sudden emergency. It reminded people to pay attention, to keep moving, and to remain aware of the shifting possibilities within the land around them. The experience of hunger therefore became woven into the everyday relationship between human beings and the environments they inhabited, shaping patterns of travel, cooperation, and memory across countless generations. Over long stretches of human history, the experience of eating was rarely separated from the broader patterns of movement across the land. People did not simply remain in one place waiting for food to appear. Instead, they moved through territories that were understood not as fixed locations, but as living systems that changed through time. Rivers rose and fell with the seasons, plants ripened in cycles that could shift slightly from year to year, and animals followed routes shaped by water, grass, and weather. To live within such landscapes required constant awareness. Knowledge about food was not limited to identifying what could be eaten. It also included knowing when something might become available, how long it would remain there, and when it would be necessary to move on. In this sense, the search for nourishment was closely tied to the rhythms of the environment itself. The body that evolved within this context gradually learned to function alongside these rhythms rather than against them. Hunger often appeared during the intervals between successful moments of gathering or hunting, and those intervals could vary in length. Some days may have brought immediate opportunities to eat, while other days required patience as people continued moving and observing. Modern research into metabolism suggests that the human body is capable of maintaining stable function during moderate fluctuations in energy intake. Stored energy can be mobilized when necessary, allowing people to continue walking, thinking, and working, even when food has not recently been consumed. These capabilities do not remove the need for nourishment, but they do illustrate how human physiology has been shaped by environments where regular meals were not guaranteed. Archaeological evidence also offers small glimpses into how ancient people navigated these uncertainties. At many prehistoric sites, researchers have discovered remains that suggest groups returned repeatedly to particular locations where food was seasonally abundant. Certain riverbanks, coastal areas, or forest clearings appear to have served as temporary gathering places during periods when fish, shellfish, fruits, or animals were more easily found. These patterns hint at a form of movement guided by ecological memory. People remembered where food had appeared in previous years and returned to those places when conditions seemed favorable again. Yet even these locations could not promise certainty. Environmental conditions might change, animal populations might shift, or unexpected weather might alter the availability of plants. Because of this, knowledge about the land was always combined with flexibility. Communities learned to adapt when familiar places did not provide what they expected. Within groups, cooperation also played a quiet but essential role in managing these uncertainties. Food that was found or captured was often shared among members of the group, spreading the benefits of success across many individuals. Anthropological observations of contemporary foraging societies show that sharing can help stabilize daily life when food acquisition is unpredictable. A successful hunt by one person may support several others, and at another time those roles may reverse. Through this kind of social structure, hunger did not fall entirely on isolated individuals. Instead, it became part of a shared experience that communities navigated together. Even so, sharing did not eliminate the deeper ecological reality that food availability changed from day to day and season to season. The need to keep searching remained central to human life. Across thousands of generations, this pattern left subtle marks on human behavior and biology. The body remained attentive to signals related to food, and the mind developed abilities for remembering landscapes, tracking animals, and recognizing edible plants. These skills helped people survive in environments where nourishment could never be assumed to be waiting nearby. When seen from the perspective of modern life, where food may be stored in kitchens or transported across continents, it can be difficult to imagine a world organized around this constant attentiveness to the land. Yet for the overwhelming majority of human existence, daily life unfolded within that world. Hunger was not a rare disruption of comfort, but a quiet reminder that survival depended on continuing the long relationship between the human body and the changing landscapes that sustained it. When early humans moved through ancient landscapes, they entered environments that were alive with plants and animals. Yet those environments did not distribute food evenly across time or space. The presence of life in a forest or grassland did not mean that nourishment was always within reach. Many edible plants appeared only during specific periods of the year. Fruits ripened briefly and then vanished. Seeds matured and fell to the ground before being scattered or consumed by animals. And underground roots required knowledge and effort to locate. In other words, food existed within these ecosystems, but it was often hidden within cycles that demanded patience and familiarity with the land. For people living long before agriculture or permanent storage, these cycles shaped how daily life unfolded. The landscape itself acted almost like a shifting map of opportunity. At one time of the year, a riverbank might provide fish or shellfish that could be gathered with relative ease. At another time, the same place might offer little nourishment at all. Grasslands that supported grazing animals could suddenly grow quiet if herds moved in search of water or fresh vegetation. These movements were not random. They followed patterns shaped by rainfall, temperature, and plant growth. Yet, even when those patterns were generally understood, they were not perfectly predictable. Weather could shift unexpectedly, storms could change migration routes, and drought could reduce the availability of plants that people depended upon. Because of this, human groups learned to read landscapes carefully, paying attention to small signs that revealed how the environment was changing. A slight difference in the flowering of certain plants might signal that fruits would soon appear nearby. Fresh tracks in the soil could indicate that animals had passed through recently. The presence of birds or insects sometimes hinted at hidden food sources that might otherwise go unnoticed. This kind of attention to the natural world was not a specialized skill practiced by a few individuals. It was a shared knowledge that gradually developed within communities and was passed from older generations to younger ones through observation and experience. Still, knowledge could only guide people toward possibility rather than guarantee success. Even the most experienced observers could encounter days when the landscape offered little food. In these moments, hunger was not necessarily a sign that something had gone wrong. It was simply the result of living within an ecosystem that moved according to its own rhythms. The search would continue, sometimes leading to a successful discovery hours later or perhaps the following day. This pattern can be seen in many ecological systems today. In wild environments, animals often spend large portions of their time searching for nourishment rather than consuming it. Humans, as part of those ecosystems for most of their history, followed similar patterns. Eating might occur in concentrated moments when food was located, but much of the surrounding time was spent traveling, watching, and remembering where nourishment had appeared before. Archaeological sites that preserve traces of ancient camps often show evidence of short-term occupation rather than permanent residence. Layers of ash from small fires, scattered stone tools, and fragments of animal bone suggest that groups stayed in certain places only for as long as the surrounding resources could support them. When those resources declined or moved elsewhere, people moved as well. Over time, this created a pattern of life closely tied to the availability of food within each environment. From a modern perspective, where food can be transported across great distances and stored for long periods, it may seem unusual that nourishment was once so closely tied to place and season. Yet for most of human existence, food was something that appeared within the landscape rather than something that waited in permanent supply. In such conditions, hunger became intertwined with the experience of moving through the world. It encouraged attention to subtle ecological changes and reminded people that survival depended on staying connected to the shifting patterns of nature that governed when and where nourishment could be found. Even in places that appear rich with life, food rarely presents itself in a steady and predictable stream. Forests may look full of trees and vegetation, yet only a small portion of that life can actually nourish human bodies. Many plants produce fruits or seeds for only a short period before returning to long months of quiet growth. Some roots and tubers remain hidden beneath the soil, requiring both knowledge and labor to uncover. Animals too follow patterns that shift with weather, water, and the movement of the herds they depend upon. For people living within these environments long before the development of agriculture, the presence of life around them did not always translate into immediate nourishment. Instead, food appeared as moments within time, often brief and sometimes separated by long intervals of searching. Across different regions of the world, early human communities learned to recognize the seasonal timing of these opportunities. In temperate climates, spring and summer often brought the ripening of fruits, the emergence of edible greens, and the increased movement of animals raising their young. These seasons could offer periods when food was easier to locate, yet the same landscapes might become far quieter during colder months or during dry seasons when plants stopped producing and animals traveled elsewhere. In tropical regions, rainfall patterns created their own cycles, with certain foods becoming abundant after heavy rains and scarce during prolonged dry periods. These shifting patterns meant that the experience of eating was rarely separated from the broader calendar of nature. Archaeological studies from many prehistoric sites show evidence that human groups adapted their movements according to these seasonal changes. Remains of plant foods discovered in ancient camps often correspond to species that would have been available during a particular time of year. Animal bones recovered from similar sites sometimes belong to species known to migrate or gather in specific regions during certain seasons. These findings suggest that people returned to familiar landscapes when conditions made food more accessible, yet returning to a place did not guarantee that the same resources would appear in exactly the same way each year. Climate fluctuations, variations in rainfall, or changes in animal populations could alter the expected patterns. Because of this, survival depended not only on remembering where food had appeared before, but also on remaining flexible when the environment behaved differently. This flexibility shaped the way human groups interacted with the land. Instead of relying on a single source of nourishment, communities made use of a wide range of plants and animals. If one food became scarce, attention could shift toward another that happened to be available at that time. This broad approach to diet is visible in the diversity of animal bones, plant residues, and stone tools discovered at prehistoric archaeological sites. Some tools appear designed for cutting meat, while others show wear patterns associated with processing plant materials. Such diversity reflects a strategy that allowed humans to respond to changing conditions without depending entirely on one type of resource. Still, the ability to adapt did not remove the underlying uncertainty of ecosystems. Some days would naturally provide more food than others, even within the same season. A successful hunt might provide nourishment for many people at once, while other attempts might produce nothing at all. Similarly, gathering expeditions could reveal patches of edible plants one day and empty ground the next. These variations meant that eating often occurred in clusters of opportunity, rather than in regular intervals. Between those opportunities, the body might experience the familiar sensation of hunger while the search continued. Over thousands of generations, human life unfolded within this rhythm of seasonal change and ecological variation. Hunger, therefore, became intertwined with the broader cycles of the natural world, appearing not as a sudden emergency but as part of the ordinary experience of living in landscapes where nourishment was shaped by time, weather, and the quiet movements of plants and animals. Over longer stretches of time, the landscapes where early humans lived were shaped not only by seasons but also by gradual environmental changes that unfolded across generations. Rainfall patterns could shift over decades, rivers could change their courses, and regions that once supported large populations of animals could become less productive as vegetation changed. These transformations were part of the natural dynamics of ecosystems. For communities that depended directly on those ecosystems for nourishment, such changes required constant adjustment. A valley that once offered reliable sources of plant foods might slowly produce less over time, encouraging people to travel farther or explore new territories. In other places, the arrival of new plant species or changes in animal migration routes could briefly increase the availability of food before conditions shifted again. These long-term fluctuations remind us that ancient environments were not static backgrounds to human life. They were active systems that continuously reshaped the opportunities available to those who lived within them. Because of this, early humans developed ways of observing patterns that extended beyond a single day or season. Knowledge about the land included memories of how particular places behaved across many years. Elders in a community might recall where animals had once gathered during certain weather conditions, or where edible plants had appeared after a particular type of rainfall. This kind of knowledge helped groups anticipate possibilities, but it still operated within a world that could never be fully controlled. Even when a location had been productive in the past, there was always the chance that it would provide less food the next time people returned. The experience of searching therefore remained central to daily life. It involved not only walking across the landscape but also interpreting signs that suggested whether the land was offering nourishment at that moment. Archaeological evidence suggests that this movement across territories was often organized through networks of familiar routes rather than random wandering. Ancient campsites discovered by researchers sometimes appear in clusters across regions where water, plants, and animals would have created favorable conditions for human life. These locations may have served as temporary resting places within larger cycles of movement. Groups might remain in one area while resources were plentiful and then gradually move to another location as conditions changed. Such patterns of mobility allowed people to respond to the uneven distribution of food across the landscape. Yet mobility itself required energy, and that energy ultimately came from the very food people were seeking. This created a delicate balance between searching and sustaining the body during periods when nourishment was limited. Within this balance, hunger became a familiar sensation that accompanied travel and exploration. It signaled the need to remain attentive to the environment and encouraged people to continue observing the subtle details that might reveal the presence of food. The body's ability to remain active during these intervals reflects physiological traits that developed over long evolutionary periods. Human muscles, metabolism, and energy storage systems all contribute to maintaining function when meals are not immediately available. These traits do not eliminate the need for regular nourishment, but they help explain how early humans could move across landscapes and continue searching even when food had not been found recently. Over thousands of generations, the interaction between environmental change and human adaptation created a way of life closely connected to the rhythms of the natural world. Food was rarely absent from the environment as a whole, yet it was rarely gathered without effort or uncertainty. It existed within a shifting mosaic of seasons, weather patterns, and ecological transformations that required people to remain flexible and attentive. In this context, hunger was not simply the absence of food. It was part of the ongoing dialogue between the human body and the changing landscapes that sustained it. Each time the body felt that quiet signal, it reflected a long evolutionary history in which survival depended on continuing the search within environments where nourishment appeared and disappeared, according to forces far larger than any single human community. In the deep past of the human story, finding food was rarely a short event followed by long comfort. Instead, it was a continuous process that shaped how people moved, watched, and interacted with the landscape around them. The search for calories required time, patience, and attention, often unfolding slowly across the day as individuals or small groups moved through familiar territories. Early humans did not encounter food neatly arranged in predictable places. They encountered scattered opportunities that had to be noticed and carefully approached. A patch of edible plants might appear along a riverbank. A cluster of insects might gather beneath fallen wood, or an animal might pass through a valley that had been quiet only hours before. Each of these moments represented a possibility rather than a guarantee, and recognizing those possibilities depended on the ability to read subtle signs in the environment. Across many regions where humans lived before the development of agriculture, obtaining food involved combining several different activities. Gathering plant foods was often an important part of daily life. Fruits, nuts, seeds, leaves, and underground roots provided energy and nutrients when they could be found. Yet locating these resources was not always simple. Many edible plants resemble others that are not suitable for consumption, and the useful parts of a plant might appear only at certain stages of growth. Knowledge about when a plant ripens or where it tends to grow was therefore essential. This knowledge developed gradually as people spent years observing the land and learning from those who had lived there longer. Hunting animals added another layer of complexity to the search for nourishment. Animals moved through landscapes according to their own needs for water, shelter, and food. A herd might pass through one area during a particular season and then travel far beyond that place when conditions changed. For hunters, this meant that success depended not only on physical skill but also on understanding how animals behaved within the environment. Tracks in soft ground, broken vegetation, and distant sounds could all provide clues that guided a search. Even when animals were located, the outcome of a hunt was uncertain. Some attempts might succeed and provide a large source of food for a group, while others might end without any capture at all. Because both gathering and hunting involved uncertainty, the daily search for calories often extended across many hours. Anthropological research on communities that continue to practice forms of foraging today shows that people may spend significant portions of their day traveling through the landscape, observing, collecting, and occasionally returning to camp with what they have found. These patterns do not suggest constant hardship, but they do illustrate how closely human life was connected to the effort required to obtain nourishment. Eating itself often occurred in concentrated moments when food became available, rather than in evenly spaced meals. A successful gathering trip might provide fruits or roots that could be shared immediately, while a successful hunt might lead to a larger meal distributed among many members of a group. Between these moments, the body might continue functioning while the search resumed. Archaeological discoveries support this picture of varied and opportunistic diets. At prehistoric sites, researchers often find evidence that people used many different food sources within the same region. Bones from small animals may appear alongside the remains of larger prey, and plant residues preserved on ancient tools reveal the processing of seeds, tubers, or other edible materials. This diversity suggests that humans relied on a flexible approach to nourishment, turning to whichever resources happened to be available within the landscape at a given time. Over countless generations, this pattern of searching shaped both behavior and biology. The human mind became skilled at remembering places where food had been found before, and the body developed the capacity to remain active during periods when the next meal had not yet appeared. In such a world, hunger did not always signal immediate danger. Instead, it often accompanied the long and careful process of discovering the scattered sources of energy that allowed human communities to continue moving through the landscapes they called home. In many ancient environments, the effort required to obtain nourishment extended far beyond the moment when food was finally eaten. The process often began with observation and movement, sometimes hours before anything edible was actually collected. Early humans traveled through territories where resources were scattered across large areas, and reaching those resources required both physical endurance and careful judgment. A valley might contain edible plants in one season but offer little during another. A group of animals might appear briefly in a region before continuing their journey to another landscape. Because of this, people could not rely on remaining in one place and waiting for food to arrive. Instead, they developed habits of steady exploration, moving through the land while paying attention to subtle details that revealed where energy might be found. The search for calories therefore unfolded gradually, shaped by the geography of the region and the seasonal rhythms that govern plants and animals. Gathering plant foods often formed a dependable foundation within this broader search. Fruits, seeds, nuts, and underground tubers could sometimes be collected without the risks involved in hunting animals. Yet gathering was rarely effortless. Many useful plants grow in scattered patches, requiring people to travel between locations that might be separated by considerable distance. In addition, some edible foods required preparation before they could be safely eaten. Hard seeds might need to be ground, fibrous roots might require roasting, and certain plants had to be processed to remove bitter or irritating compounds. These tasks added time and labor to the process of transforming wild resources into usable nourishment. Even after food had been located, the work of preparing it could continue for some time before anyone began to eat. Hunting introduced a different set of uncertainties. Animals possess their own awareness of the landscape and are often alert to the presence of predators, including humans. Approaching them requires patience, coordination, and sometimes the cooperation of several individuals working together. Some hunts may have lasted many hours as people followed tracks or waited quietly near places where animals were likely to appear. At other times, the opportunity to capture prey might arise suddenly and disappear just as quickly. A successful hunt could provide a large quantity of meat, but such success was never guaranteed. Many attempts ended without a capture, leaving hunters to return with knowledge gained but without immediate nourishment. These uncertainties meant that the effort spent searching for food often exceeded the time spent eating it. Anthropologists studying foraging societies have frequently noted that daily life involves extended periods of travel, observation, and gathering punctuated by shorter moments when food is actually consumed. Within these patterns, the body becomes accustomed to functioning while energy intake fluctuates. A successful day of gathering or hunting may provide enough nourishment to sustain activity for some time, while quieter days require the body to draw on stored energy reserves. Over long evolutionary periods, these cycles likely shaped the physiological flexibility that allows humans to remain active during intervals when meals are not immediately available. Archaeological evidence again supports the idea that ancient diets depended on a wide range of foods obtained through persistent effort. Remains found at prehistoric sites reveal not only large animals but also smaller creatures, plant materials, and aquatic resources such as fish or shellfish. This diversity reflects a strategy that reduced reliance on any single food source. When one resource became difficult to obtain, others could sometimes fill the gap. Even with such flexibility, however, the search for nourishment remained a central activity woven into the fabric of daily life. Hunger, in this context, was not merely a temporary discomfort. It was a familiar signal accompanying the long process through which human communities located and transformed the scattered energy of the natural world into the food that sustained them. As the long search for food continued across generations, human communities gradually developed patterns that helped them manage the effort required to obtain energy from the landscape. These patterns were not strict schedules in the modern sense, but they reflected practical ways of organizing movement and cooperation. Individuals within a group often specialized in different tasks depending on their experience, physical ability, and knowledge of particular resources. Some people might focus on identifying and gathering plant foods that were known to appear in certain environments, while others might concentrate on tracking animals or locating water sources where animals were likely to gather. This division of attention allowed the group as a whole to explore multiple possibilities at the same time. If one search produced little food, another might succeed, and the results could then be shared among the community. Over time, this cooperative approach helped reduce the risks associated with relying on a single method of obtaining nourishment. Even with cooperation, however, the effort required to find calories remained substantial. Many edible plants provide relatively small amounts of energy per individual portion, meaning that gathering often involved collecting numerous items before a meaningful quantity of food had been obtained. Nuts, seeds, and tubers could be valuable sources of nourishment, but they frequently required time to harvest and process. Similarly, the capture of animals depended on patience and the ability to read the landscape carefully. Some animals could be approached directly, while others required hunters to wait quietly near water or along migration routes. These strategies demanded attention and endurance, rather than speed alone. As a result, hours of effort might pass before food was secured. Anthropological observations of foraging societies illustrate how these patterns shape the rhythm of daily life. A day might begin with individuals leaving a temporary camp and traveling outward into the surrounding environment. Along the way, people observe signs of edible plants, listen for movements in the distance, and recall places where resources had been found before. When food is discovered, it may be gathered immediately or processed so that it can be shared later with others in the group. When the search does not succeed quickly, people continue moving, relying on experience and memory to guide them toward areas that might offer better opportunities. Through this process, the landscape becomes a network of remembered locations where nourishment has appeared at different times. Archaeological sites provide small but meaningful glimpses of these activities. Tools used for cutting, grinding, and scraping are often found together with the remains of both plant and animal foods. Such evidence suggests that early humans combined many techniques to obtain calories from their surroundings. Grinding stones indicate the processing of seeds or grains, while sharp stone edges show signs of cutting meat or preparing plant fibers. These tools reflect practical solutions developed over thousands of years to transform raw materials from the environment into usable nourishment. The presence of such tools also reveals that obtaining food was not simply a matter of finding it, but also of preparing it in ways that made it digestible and safe to consume. Within this extended process, the sensation of hunger would naturally appear between moments of success. The body might signal the need for energy while the search was still unfolding. Yet the continuation of activity during those intervals demonstrates how closely human biology and behavior became aligned with environments where food did not appear instantly. The ability to remain attentive, cooperative, and physically active even when the next meal had not yet arrived, was part of the broader adaptation that allowed humans to live in many different landscapes. Across long stretches of human history, survival depended on this patient interaction with the land, where nourishment was rarely immediate, and where the effort of searching formed a central part of everyday life. Long before the development of farms, markets, or food storage on a large scale, the human body evolved within environments where energy intake changed from day to day. These fluctuations were not rare accidents, but regular features of life in landscapes where nourishment appeared unevenly. Because of this, the human body gradually developed ways of coping with uncertainty in the supply of calories. The systems that regulate hunger, energy storage, and metabolism are part of this long adaptation. Rather than expecting food to arrive at precise intervals, the body became capable of adjusting to periods when nourishment was plentiful and other periods when it was limited. This flexibility allowed early humans to remain active while searching for food even when the most recent meal had occurred many hours earlier. One of the most important aspects of this adaptation is the body's ability to store energy for later use. When food becomes available, excess energy can be converted into forms that the body can preserve, particularly in fat tissue. These reserves serve as a temporary buffer against future scarcity. In environments where the timing of food could not be predicted with certainty, such storage offered an important advantage. Individuals who could accumulate energy when resources were abundant were more likely to continue functioning during times when food was harder to find. Over long evolutionary periods, this capacity for storage became a normal part of human physiology. It does not mean that early humans were constantly accumulating large reserves, but it does show that the body evolved mechanisms designed to smooth out the uneven patterns of nourishment provided by natural ecosystems. The regulation of hunger also reflects this evolutionary history. Hunger is controlled by a complex network of signals involving the brain, digestive organs, and chemical messengers circulating in the bloodstream. These signals help the body monitor energy levels and encourage eating when reserves begin to decline. In modern environments where food can be obtained quickly, hunger may feel like a simple reminder to eat. Yet in the deeper history of the species, this signal functioned as part of a broader survival system. Hunger helped maintain attention toward the search for nourishment, encouraging continued exploration of the environment when energy intake had not recently occurred. Instead of indicating immediate danger, the sensation often served as a guide directing behavior toward the next opportunity to obtain calories. The human brain also plays a central role in coordinating these responses. Regions involved in motivation and reward become active when food is discovered or anticipated. This response encourages individuals to remember where nourishment was found and to return to similar places in the future. Such mechanisms are widely studied in modern neuroscience and are understood as part of the biological systems that link behavior with survival. Over many generations, these systems helped shape the relationship between human beings and the landscapes that sustained them. When food was located after a period of searching, the body responded in ways that reinforced the memory of that experience, making it easier to repeat successful strategies later. Archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that these physiological traits supported human expansion into many different environments. Because the body could tolerate moderate fluctuations in energy intake, people were able to travel across regions where food resources were scattered and sometimes unpredictable. This resilience did not remove the need for nourishment, but it allowed human groups to remain active during the intervals between successful hunts or gathering expeditions. In this sense, the human body itself carries traces of the long relationship between our species and the ecological uncertainty of the natural world. The systems that regulate hunger, energy storage, and motivation did not emerge in environments of constant abundance. They developed within landscapes where nourishment appeared intermittently and where survival depended on the ability to endure those intervals while continuing the search for food. Within the human body, the regulation of energy does not depend on a single organ or signal. Instead, it emerges from the coordination of many systems that continuously monitor the balance between energy intake and energy use. Long before the modern world created environments where food could be obtained with little effort, these systems developed within conditions where nourishment arrived irregularly. As a result, the body became capable of responding to changing circumstances rather than expecting a constant supply. One of the ways this flexibility appears is through the interaction between stored energy and the signals that influence appetite. When the body receives nourishment, nutrients enter the bloodstream and are distributed to tissues that require immediate fuel. At the same time, any surplus energy can be stored for later use. Fat tissue plays an important role in this process. Rather than serving merely as passive storage, it participates in a complex system of communication that informs the brain about the body's energy reserves. These signals help regulate when the sensation of hunger becomes stronger and when it gradually fades after eating. Scientific research has shown that certain chemical messengers produced by fat tissue and digestive organs help the brain monitor these changes. The brain, particularly regions involved in regulating appetite and motivation, integrates this information and influences behavior accordingly. When energy reserves begin to decline, signals associated with hunger become more noticeable, encouraging the search for food. When nourishment has recently been obtained and reserves are sufficient, the intensity of these signals often decreases. This balance allows the body to adapt to fluctuating circumstances rather than depending on rigid timing. In environments where food could not be predicted from one moment to the next, such adaptability offered clear advantages. It allowed individuals to remain active even when the exact timing of the next meal was uncertain. The digestive system itself also reflects this evolutionary background. Humans possess the ability to process a wide range of foods, from plant materials rich in carbohydrates to animal tissues containing protein and fat. This dietary flexibility helps explain how human groups were able to survive in many different ecosystems across the world. In some environments, plant foods might provide the majority of daily energy, while in others, animal foods could play a larger role. The digestive system, working together with metabolic processes in the liver and muscles, helps convert these varied sources into usable energy for the body. This versatility does not mean that all foods are equally available or equally easy to obtain, but it does illustrate how human biology became suited to environments where the types of nourishment could change with location and season. The experience of hunger is therefore part of a much larger system designed to guide behavior within uncertain environments. It encourages awareness of energy needs without immediately preventing activity. People can continue walking, observing, and cooperating with others while the body gradually draws upon stored reserves. Over the course of a day, or sometimes longer intervals, this ability to maintain function allows the search for food to continue until nourishment becomes available again. Anthropologists studying traditional foraging societies have often observed that daily life can include extended periods of travel or work between moments of eating. While the exact patterns vary between cultures and environments, these observations demonstrate how the human body can remain productive, even when meals are not evenly spaced. Archaeological evidence also supports the idea that early humans regularly navigated landscapes where food resources were scattered. The presence of campsites separated by many kilometers suggests that people were capable of traveling significant distances in the process of locating nourishment. Such journeys would have required both physical endurance and metabolic flexibility. Over many generations, the systems that regulate energy storage, appetite, and metabolism helped human communities adapt to these conditions. Hunger, within this framework, is not simply a reaction to the absence of food. It is part of a coordinated biological process that connects the body to its environment, encouraging continued attention to the opportunities for nourishment that appear within the changing patterns of the natural world. Over the long course of human evolution, the body did not develop in isolation from the challenges of the natural world. Every organ system, from the muscles that carry us across landscapes to the brain that guides decisions, emerged within environments where energy had to be located, gathered, and sometimes patiently awaited. Because nourishment was not always immediate, the body gradually acquired the ability to function through shifting levels of available fuel. This capacity is not unlimited, and it does not eliminate the need for regular nourishment, but it does show how closely human biology is connected to a history of uncertainty in food supply. When food is eaten, the body begins a sequence of processes that transform raw nutrients into usable energy. Carbohydrates are broken down into simpler molecules that circulate in the bloodstream. Proteins are processed into components that help maintain tissues, and fats can serve both as immediate fuel and as stored reserves. These pathways allow the body to maintain the steady internal conditions required for survival even while the external environment changes. Yet the body does not rely solely on the most recent meal to support activity. When energy intake temporarily decreases, stored reserves begin to play a greater role. Fat tissue gradually releases energy into the bloodstream, allowing muscles and organs to continue functioning. The liver also participates by regulating how energy is distributed throughout the body, helping maintain stable levels of fuel for the brain and other vital systems. These processes demonstrate how the body acts as a bridge between moments of abundance and moments of scarcity. Rather than shutting down when food is not immediately available, the body can draw upon earlier resources that were stored during more favorable times. This pattern reflects the ecological conditions in which human physiology developed. For early humans moving across landscapes in search of nourishment, it was common for the time between successful food discoveries to vary. One day might provide abundant resources, while another might involve extended searching before anything edible was found. Over many generations, Individuals whose bodies could tolerate these variations were more likely to remain active and survive. Gradually, this resilience became a normal feature of human metabolism. The experience of hunger fits naturally within this system. Hunger emerges as the body begins to sense that recently available energy is declining and that the search for new nourishment should continue. Importantly, this signal does not always correspond to an immediate crisis. It often appears while the body still possesses stored reserves that can support activity for some time. This allows individuals to remain engaged with their surroundings, continuing to observe the land and cooperate with others in the ongoing process of locating food. In modern environments where food can be obtained quickly, the sensation of hunger may sometimes feel inconvenient or surprising. Yet in the longer perspective of human history, it functioned as a familiar guide rather than an alarm. Archaeological and anthropological research reinforces this understanding by revealing how human communities repeatedly navigated landscapes where resources were scattered and seasonal. The presence of tools for processing plant foods, hunting animals, and preparing meals suggests that obtaining nourishment required both physical effort and technical knowledge. These tools helped transform raw materials from the environment into food that the body could use, but they did not eliminate the need for patience and persistence in the search itself. Across thousands of generations, the human body and human behavior evolved together within this context. Metabolism, appetite regulation, and energy storage became intertwined with patterns of movement across the land and the social cooperation that helped groups manage uncertainty. Hunger, therefore, became more than a temporary sensation. It became part of the larger dialogue between the human organism and the environments that sustained it. Even today, the quiet signal that reminds the body to seek nourishment carries echoes of that long relationship, reflecting a biological heritage shaped by countless days when the next source of food had not yet been found, but the search continued. Among the many features that distinguish humans from other species, the size and complexity of the human brain is one of the most remarkable. Yet this remarkable organ comes with a significant biological cost. The brain requires a steady supply of energy in order to maintain its activity. Even when the body is resting, the brain continues to process information, regulate bodily systems, and maintain the internal balance that allows the organism to remain alive. Because of this constant activity, the brain consumes a substantial portion of the energy that the body uses each day. From an evolutionary perspective, this created an unusual situation. As the human brain gradually increased in size and capability over hundreds of thousands of years, the need for reliable energy also grew. At the same time, humans continued to live within environments where food resources were uneven and unpredictable. The body, therefore, had to support an organ that demanded regular fuel while living in landscapes where nourishment could not always be obtained immediately. One way this challenge was addressed was through the flexibility of human diets. Humans became capable of consuming a wide range of foods, including plant materials, animal tissues, and aquatic resources. This diversity allowed communities to gather energy from different parts of the environment depending on what was available in a particular region or season. In some places, plant foods might provide a large portion of daily nourishment, while in others, hunting or fishing might play a more significant role. By expanding the range of edible resources, early humans improved their chances of obtaining the calories required to sustain both body and brain. Another factor involved the social nature of human life. Unlike many solitary species, humans often lived and moved in groups where cooperation played an important role in obtaining food. Sharing resources within a community helped distribute the benefits of successful hunts or gathering trips among multiple individuals. When one member of a group found a valuable source of food, others could also benefit from that discovery. Over time, this pattern of cooperation likely helped reduce the risks associated with the irregular appearance of nourishment in natural ecosystems. The brain itself contributed to this process by supporting memory, planning, and communication. Remembering the locations where food had appeared in previous seasons allowed groups to return to those areas when conditions seemed favorable again. Planning movements across landscapes helped people coordinate their activities and avoid wasting energy traveling through areas that were unlikely to provide nourishment. Communication within the group allowed knowledge about edible plants, animal behavior, and safe preparation techniques to spread from one person to another and from one generation to the next. These abilities did not remove the uncertainty of the environment, but they helped human communities respond more effectively to it. Even with these advantages, however, the relationship between the human brain and the availability of food remained delicate. The brain requires a continuous flow of energy, yet the ecosystems where early humans lived did not always provide food at regular intervals. This meant that the body's systems for storing and releasing energy had to function reliably in order to support brain activity during periods when nourishment had not recently been obtained. Fat reserves, metabolic flexibility, and the regulation of appetite all contributed to maintaining this balance. These mechanisms allowed the brain to continue operating while the search for food continued. Archaeological evidence suggests that as human cognitive abilities expanded, so did the complexity of the tools and strategies used to obtain nourishment. Stone tools for cutting, grinding, and processing foods became more refined over time. These tools made it easier to access the energy stored in plants and animals, helping transform raw resources into meals that could sustain growing communities. In this way, the relationship between hunger and intelligence may have been closely connected throughout human history. The brain required energy to function, yet it also helped humans discover new ways to obtain that energy from the environment. Within this ongoing exchange, hunger remained a constant companion, quietly reminding the body that the next source of nourishment still needed to be found. As the human brain expanded through evolutionary time, the relationship between energy and behavior became increasingly important. The brain does not store large reserves of fuel within itself, which means that it depends on a continuous supply of energy delivered through the bloodstream. Even small interruptions in that supply can affect concentration, coordination, and awareness. Because of this, the growing energy demands of the brain likely place strong pressures on human communities to find reliable ways of obtaining calories from the environment. Yet the landscapes where early humans lived did not always provide food in steady or predictable amounts. This created a situation in which the brain's high energy requirements had to be balanced against the irregular nature of natural ecosystems. One of the ways humans responded to this challenge was by developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for locating and processing food. The brain's ability to recognize patterns, remember past experiences, and anticipate future opportunities helped guide people toward places where nourishment was more likely to appear. A valley that had produced fruit during a previous season might become a destination once the same conditions returned. A water source where animals had gathered before might again become a place where hunters waited quietly for movement in the distance. Through these repeated experiences, knowledge about the environment accumulated within communities. Over time, such knowledge made the search for food more efficient, even though it could never remove uncertainty entirely. The brain also supported cooperation, which played a central role in managing the uneven distribution of resources. In many human societies, food obtained by one individual could be shared among several others. Anthropological studies suggest that this pattern of sharing has deep roots in human social life. When a large animal was successfully hunted, the resulting food could nourish an entire group. At other times, individuals who gathered plant foods might distribute them among family members or neighbors within the community. These practices helped reduce the risk that any single person would face extended periods without nourishment. Instead of each individual relying only on personal success, the group as a whole contributed to maintaining stability in the face of environmental uncertainty. Communication further strengthened this cooperative system. The human brain is capable of complex language and symbolic thought, abilities that allow people to exchange detailed information about the world around them. Through conversation and teaching, knowledge about edible plants, seasonal changes, and hunting strategies could be transmitted across generations. Younger members of the community learned where certain foods were likely to appear, how to recognize signs of animal movement, and how to prepare unfamiliar resources safely. This shared understanding allowed groups to coordinate their efforts more effectively when searching for nourishment. Even so, the existence of cooperation and knowledge did not eliminate the need for continued attention to hunger signals within the body. Hunger still served as a reminder that energy was required to sustain both physical activity and brain function. In environments where the next meal could not be guaranteed, these signals encouraged individuals to remain engaged in the search for food and to participate in the cooperative activities that helped communities survive. The brain, while demanding large amounts of energy, also provided the cognitive abilities necessary to obtain that energy more effectively. This relationship created a subtle feedback loop within human evolution. The need to nourish the brain encouraged the development of behaviors that improved access to food, and those behaviors in turn supported the continued functioning of the brain. Archaeological findings reflect this interplay between cognition and nourishment. Over time, tools used for processing plants, hunting animals, and preparing food became more diverse and carefully shaped. Grinding stones, cutting implements, and other tools reveal that people were increasingly able to extract energy from the resources around them. These developments did not guarantee abundance, but they demonstrate how the growing capabilities of the human brain helped communities navigate environments where food appeared intermittently. Within this ongoing process, hunger remained a familiar companion, quietly linking the biological needs of the brain to the practical work of finding energy within the natural world. As human communities continued to rely on cooperation and shared knowledge to locate food, the relationship between the brain and nourishment became more deeply intertwined. The brain does not simply react to hunger, it also helps guide behavior in ways that improve the chances of finding energy in complex environments. Memory, for example, allows individuals to recall places where food was previously discovered. Over time, these memories form mental maps of landscapes that include rivers, valleys, groves of fruit-bearing trees, and other locations where nourishment has appeared in the past. Such maps are not fixed drawings in the mind, but evolving collections of experience that grow richer with each journey across the land. When groups move through familiar territories, these memories help guide decisions about where to travel next and where to invest time searching for food. This ability to remember and compare past experiences likely played a significant role in how human groups navigated environments where resources were scattered. Instead of exploring blindly, people could return to areas that had previously provided nourishment while remaining alert to new opportunities that appeared unexpectedly. Planning also became increasingly important. The brain allows humans to imagine future situations and prepare for them. In the context of obtaining food, this could involve organizing a group to search different parts of the landscape, preparing tools in advance of a hunting attempt, or traveling toward regions where seasonal changes suggested that food might soon become available. These forms of planning do not remove uncertainty, but they help reduce wasted effort and improve the efficiency of the search. Even when a particular attempt fails, the knowledge gained during that effort can inform future decisions. Through repeated experiences, communities gradually refine their strategies for interacting with the environment. The brain's role in communication further strengthens this process. Human language makes it possible to describe events that others did not directly witness. Someone who discovers a patch of edible plants can explain where it is located and how to recognize it. Hunters who observe the behavior of animals can share that information with others before the next attempt begins. This exchange of knowledge allows communities to build a collective understanding of the landscape that extends beyond the experiences of any single individual. Over generations, such knowledge becomes part of cultural traditions, passed from elders to younger members through stories, teaching, and daily practice. Within this shared system, the search for food becomes not only a biological task but also a social activity shaped by cooperation and learning. Even with these cognitive and social advantages, however, the fundamental challenge remains the same. The human brain requires energy, yet the ecosystems where early humans lived provided food in patterns that were often irregular. To maintain brain function, the body depended on its ability to store energy and release it gradually when new nourishment had not yet been found. Hunger signals played a key role in coordinating this balance. They reminded individuals to remain attentive to opportunities for food while the body continued to rely on previously stored energy. In this way, hunger functioned as both a biological signal and a behavioral guide, linking the needs of the brain to the actions required to obtain nourishment. Archaeological discoveries offer subtle evidence of how these processes unfolded over time. The increasing variety of tools found at ancient sites suggests that human communities were experimenting with new methods for accessing energy from the environment. Grinding stones indicate the processing of seeds and grains, while sharpened implements reveal techniques for cutting meat and preparing plant materials. These tools reflect the combined influence of cognitive ability, cooperation, and persistent effort in the search for calories. Across thousands of generations, the expanding capabilities of the human brain and the ongoing need for energy formed a dynamic relationship. The brain required nourishment to function, yet it also enabled humans to navigate the uncertain landscapes where that nourishment had to be found. In this quiet exchange between biology and environment, hunger remained a constant presence, gently urging the body to continue participating in the long process through which energy was discovered, shared, and transformed into the fuel that sustained human life. Long before written records existed, traces of human life were gradually preserved in the ground. Layers of soil, fragments of bone, and the remains of ancient tools now allow researchers to glimpse how people lived thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years ago. These traces are often small and incomplete, yet when studied carefully they reveal patterns that help explain how early humans obtained food and how their bodies responded to changing conditions. Among the most important pieces of evidence are human bones and teeth. These structures can survive for very long periods, and they often carry subtle marks that reflect the environments and diets experienced during life. By examining them closely, scientists can learn about the kinds of foods people ate, the stresses their bodies encountered, and the ways communities adapted to the landscapes around them. Teeth, in particular, provide valuable clues about ancient diets. The surfaces of teeth often preserve microscopic wear patterns created when food is chewed. Different kinds of foods produce different kinds of wear. Hard seeds or gritty plant materials can leave small scratches, while softer foods create different textures on the enamel surface. By comparing these patterns with those produced by known foods today, researchers can estimate the kinds of materials that were regularly eaten in the past. These studies suggest that early human diets were diverse and flexible. In some regions, people relied heavily on plant foods, such as seeds, fruits, and underground tubers. In other areas, animal foods appear to have played a larger role. The variety of wear patterns seen in ancient teeth supports the idea that human communities adjusted their diets according to what was available in each environment. Teeth can also preserve chemical signals that offer additional information about ancient nourishment. Elements absorbed from food become incorporated into growing bones and teeth during life. By analyzing these elements, scientists can sometimes identify whether a person's diet contained more plant-based foods or more animal-derived foods. This technique does not reveal exact meals, but it provides broad insights into the types of ecosystems people depended upon. Studies using these methods have shown that early human diets varied across different regions of the world. Some communities lived in environments where plant foods were abundant for part of the year, while others inhabited landscapes where hunting played a greater role. Such differences illustrate how closely human nourishment was tied to local ecological conditions. Bones themselves can also reveal signs of nutritional stress. During periods when food was less available, the body sometimes responded in ways that left small marks in growing tissues. In children, temporary disruptions in growth can produce faint lines or irregularities in tooth enamel. These features, preserved long after death, suggest that individuals experienced intervals when nourishment was reduced or inconsistent. Importantly, such marks do not necessarily indicate severe starvation. They more often reflect the natural fluctuations in food availability that occur in environments where resources appear unevenly across seasons or years. When researchers observe these patterns across many archaeological sites, they begin to see a consistent picture emerging. Early human populations frequently lived within ecosystems where food supply changed through time. The evidence preserved in bones and teeth does not describe daily meals, but it does reveal that nourishment was shaped by environmental variability rather than constant abundance. Archaeological sites also contain the remains of animals and plants that were processed by humans. Bones of hunted animals sometimes bear clear marks left by stone tools used to cut meat from the skeleton. Plant residues preserved on grinding stones show that seeds and other plant materials were processed before being eaten. These findings demonstrate that obtaining food involved active engagement with the environment rather than passive consumption of readily available resources. Through the careful study of these remains, researchers continue to reconstruct the long relationship between human biology and the landscapes where our ancestors lived. The evidence suggests that food was rarely guaranteed, and that communities adapted to this reality through flexible diets, cooperation, and the ability to move across territories when conditions changed. Within this context, the presence of hunger in human life becomes easier to understand. It reflects a history in which nourishment often arrived in uneven patterns, shaped by the same ecological forces that governed the growth of plants and the movements of animals across the ancient world. In addition to human bones and teeth, the remains of ancient campsites provide another layer of insight into how early communities obtained their food. These sites are often scattered across landscapes that once supported temporary human activity. Over time, the materials left behind by daily life gradually became buried under layers of soil and sediment. When archaeologists carefully excavate these locations, they sometimes uncover small collections of objects and biological remains that reveal how people interacted with their environment. Among the most informative discoveries are animal bones that show clear evidence of human activity. Many bones recovered from prehistoric sites display marks left by sharp stone tools. These marks appear as fine lines along the surface of the bone, created when meat was removed from the skeleton or when bones were broken to access the nutritious marrow inside. Such traces demonstrate that early humans actively processed animal foods rather than simply consuming what they encountered by chance. The presence of bones from different animal species also provides clues about the types of environments where people lived. Some sites contain remains of large grazing animals associated with open grasslands, while others reveal smaller animals that typically inhabit forests or wetlands. This diversity reflects the ability of human communities to adapt their hunting strategies to different ecosystems. Yet even when hunting was successful, the remains found at these sites suggest that animals were not always abundant or easily obtained. In many locations, the bones discovered represent a wide variety of species, including small mammals, birds, and reptiles. This mixture indicates that people made use of whatever animal resources were available, rather than relying exclusively on large prey. Smaller animals may have provided modest amounts of meat, but they were often easier to capture and could contribute important calories when larger hunts were unsuccessful. Such evidence supports the idea that early human diets were opportunistic and flexible, shaped by the shifting availability of animals within each environment. Plant foods, although less likely to survive over long periods, also appear in archaeological evidence through indirect traces. Grinding stones discovered at ancient sites sometimes preserve microscopic residues from seeds or other plant materials. These tools often show wear patterns created by repeated grinding or crushing, suggesting that plant foods were processed before being eaten. In some cases, charred fragments of ancient seeds or tubers have been preserved in the remains of hearths, offering further clues about the kinds of foods people prepared. These findings demonstrate that plant resources played a meaningful role in human diets alongside animal foods. Because many plants produce edible parts only during certain seasons, their presence in archaeological sites also hints at the timing of human activity within particular regions. Camps located near water sources frequently reveal evidence of aquatic foods as well. Shellfish remains, fish bones, and other aquatic materials are sometimes found in large quantities at coastal or riverside sites. These discoveries suggest that human groups took advantage of resources available in lakes, rivers, and shorelines when such opportunities were present. In some environments, these foods may have provided relatively dependable sources of nourishment during particular seasons. However, even aquatic ecosystems change through time, and the abundance of fish or shellfish can fluctuate depending on water conditions and migration patterns. For this reason, the presence of aquatic foods in archaeological sites does not necessarily indicate a constant or predictable supply. When archaeologists examine these various traces together, a consistent picture begins to emerge. Early human communities relied on many different sources of nourishment, often combining plants, animals, and aquatic resources within the same landscape. This diversity suggests that survival depended on flexibility and careful observation rather than on a single dependable food source. Each resource offered opportunities at certain moments and disappeared at others. Within this dynamic environment, the effort required to locate and process food remained a central part of daily life. The archaeological record therefore supports the broader understanding that nourishment was shaped by ecological variability. Food could appear in abundance during one period and become scarce during another. Human groups responded to these changes by adapting their strategies, shifting their movements, and making use of whatever resources the land and water provided at the time. Through these fragments of bone, stone, and charred plant remains, the distant past reveals a world where the experience of hunger was closely connected to the natural rhythms of the ecosystems that sustained human life. When archaeologists bring together the many fragments discovered at ancient sites, they begin to see broader patterns that extend beyond individual camps or regions. Bones, tools, plant residues, and traces of fire collectively reveal how human communities interacted with their environments across long stretches of time. These materials rarely provide a complete picture of daily life, but when examined across hundreds of sites, they allow researchers to identify recurring themes. One of the most consistent patterns is the variability of ancient diets. Rather than depending on a single staple food, early humans appear to have drawn nourishment from whatever resources their surroundings could provide at a particular moment. This pattern is visible in the diversity of remains preserved in archaeological deposits. At some sites, the bones of large animals suggest periods when hunting produced substantial amounts of meat. At other locations, the remains of smaller animals, birds, or fish indicate that people turned to alternative sources of protein when larger prey was less available. Similarly, evidence of plant processing appears in many regions, demonstrating that seeds, fruits, and underground plant parts contributed to daily nourishment when they could be gathered. This mixture of foods reflects a strategy shaped by ecological uncertainty. If one resource became scarce, others could sometimes fill the gap, allowing communities to continue functioning despite fluctuations in the environment. Yet even with this flexibility, the archaeological record suggests that food resources rarely appeared in perfectly stable supply. Some layers within ancient sites show signs of repeated activity during particular seasons, followed by long intervals when the same location was not occupied. Such patterns may indicate that people returned to certain places only when resources were likely to be available. A riverside camp might be used during periods when fish or migrating animals passed through the area, while a woodland clearing might become important when fruits or nuts ripen nearby. These cycles of occupation hint at a broader rhythm of movement shaped by the timing of ecological events. Human groups traveled through landscapes, revisiting familiar places when conditions were favorable and moving on when the supply of food declined. Within these rhythms, the experience of nourishment would naturally fluctuate. Periods when food was abundant might allow communities to gather, process, and share resources within a relatively short time. At other moments, the search for calories may have required longer journeys or more persistent effort. Archaeological remains of hearths and cooking areas reveal that food preparation itself was an important part of these activities. Fire allowed people to roast meat, soften plant materials, and make certain foods easier to digest. These practices increased the amount of energy that could be extracted from available resources, but they did not remove the need to locate those resources in the first place. Evidence from ancient human skeletons adds another dimension to this picture. In some populations, subtle marks preserved in bones or teeth suggest that individuals experienced periodic nutritional stress during childhood. These marks do not necessarily indicate extreme deprivation, but they do reveal that food intake sometimes fluctuated enough to influence physical development. When such patterns appear across multiple archaeological populations, they reinforce the idea that early human life unfolded within environments where nourishment could not always be predicted with precision. By combining these lines of evidence, researchers gain a clearer understanding of the conditions that shaped human biology and behavior. The archaeological record does not depict a world of constant abundance, nor does it suggest that people were continuously starving. Instead, it reveals a landscape of shifting opportunities where food appeared in uneven patterns shaped by climate, geography, and the movements of other species. Human communities responded through adaptability, cooperation, and the development of tools that help them transform raw materials into nourishment. Within this complex relationship between people and environment, hunger emerges not as an unusual failure of the system, but as a natural signal that accompanied the search for energy. It reflects a long history in which the body and the landscape were closely connected, and in which survival depended on the ability to navigate ecosystems where the availability of food continually changed. In many early human societies, the experience of eating did not follow the steady rhythm that people in modern environments often expect. Instead of evenly spaced meals throughout the day, nourishment frequently arrived in clusters shaped by the unpredictable success of gathering or hunting. When food was discovered, it could sometimes be consumed in relatively large amounts within a short period of time. At other moments, hours or even longer intervals might pass before another opportunity to eat appeared. This pattern has sometimes been described by researchers as a rhythm of abundance followed by quieter periods, reflecting the uneven way resources appear within natural ecosystems. The idea does not suggest that people alternated between constant feasting and severe deprivation. Rather, it highlights how the timing of eating was often tied directly to the moment when food was successfully obtained. When a group gathered fruits, nuts, or roots from a productive area, the available food might be shared and eaten soon after it was collected. Similarly, when hunters successfully captured an animal, the resulting meat could provide a significant source of nourishment for many individuals at once. Because early humans did not possess large systems for preserving food over long periods, much of what was obtained was consumed relatively quickly. This pattern naturally created moments when the body received more energy, followed by intervals when new food had not yet been found. Anthropological observations of contemporary foraging societies offer some insight into how these rhythms can operate. In many communities that continue to rely partly on hunting and gathering, people often spend much of their day traveling, searching, or preparing tools before any food is actually eaten. When resources are found, the group may share a meal that reflects the success of that particular day. On other days, the available food may be more modest, drawn from small plant foods or animals gathered along the way. Over time, these variations form a pattern in which nourishment appears in waves rather than in a constant stream. Importantly, these waves are shaped by ecological opportunities rather than by fixed schedules. The human body appears well suited to such fluctuations. As discussed earlier, metabolic systems allow energy to be stored during times when food is available and gradually used during periods when intake is lower. This ability to smooth out uneven patterns of nourishment helps explain how human communities could remain active and productive even when meals were not evenly spaced. The body's signals of hunger and satisfaction help regulate this process, encouraging eating when energy becomes available and guiding behavior toward continued searching when it does not. Over many generations, this interaction between ecological opportunity and biological flexibility likely formed a familiar rhythm of life. Archaeological evidence also suggests that some ancient sites were used during periods when resources were temporarily abundant. For example, locations near migrating animal routes or seasonal plant harvests sometimes contain dense layers of food remains, indicating repeated gatherings during times of plenty. These gatherings may have allowed communities to process large quantities of food within a relatively short time. Once those resources declined, people likely moved on in search of other opportunities elsewhere. Such patterns reinforce the idea that the experience of nourishment was often concentrated within particular moments shaped by the landscape. This rhythm of uneven availability helps explain why hunger remained a familiar companion in human life. When food appeared, it could provide substantial nourishment. Yet the natural cycles of ecosystems meant that such moments could not always be predicted or sustained. The intervals between them required patience, cooperation, and continued attention to the environment. Over thousands of generations, the human body and mind adapted to this pattern, learning to function within a world where energy arrived not as a constant supply, but as a series of opportunities shaped by the shifting rhythms of nature. Within environments where food appeared in uneven patterns, human communities gradually developed social practices that helped them manage the shifting rhythm of nourishment. One of the most important of these practices was sharing. When food was obtained, particularly in larger quantities, it was often distributed among many members of the group rather than consumed only by the individual who had found it. This pattern has been observed in many societies that rely on hunting and gathering, where the success of one person's effort can support several others within the community. Sharing does not eliminate the variability of food availability, but it spreads the effects of that variability across the group, reducing the likelihood that any single individual will experience long periods without nourishment. The logic behind sharing becomes clearer when viewed within the context of ecological uncertainty. Hunting, for example, can produce highly uneven outcomes. A hunter may spend many hours tracking animals without success, yet on another day a single successful hunt may produce more meat than one person or family could immediately consume. In such cases, distributing the food allows the entire group to benefit from the moment of abundance. At another time, the roles may reverse, with different individuals contributing food obtained through gathering or fishing. Over time, this reciprocal pattern helps stabilize access to nourishment, even though the underlying environment remains unpredictable. Anthropologists often describe this system as a form of risk sharing. Instead of each individual facing the full consequences of unsuccessful food searches, the community spreads those risks collectively. If one effort fails, another may succeed, and the resulting food can circulate through the group. This arrangement does not guarantee equal outcomes every day, but it increases the overall resilience of the community when resources fluctuate. The practice also reinforces social bonds, since cooperation and trust become essential for maintaining the system over time. People learn that contributing food when they have it increases the likelihood that others will do the same when circumstances change. Within this cooperative framework, moments of relative abundance often become social occasions as well as nutritional ones. When a large animal is captured, or when a productive patch of plant foods is discovered, people may gather to process and share the food together. Fire frequently plays an important role in these events, allowing meat to be cooked and plant materials to be softened or made easier to digest. Archaeological remains of hearths and food processing areas suggest that such communal activities occurred repeatedly throughout human history. These gatherings likely provided opportunities for communication, teaching, and strengthening relationships within the group. At the same time, the social nature of these meals reflects the practical reality that food resources often appeared in quantities that were easier to share than to preserve. Even with sharing and cooperation, however, the rhythm of nourishment remained shaped by the environment. Some days brought more food than others, and the intervals between successful searches could vary depending on season, weather, and the movements of animals or the growth cycles of plants. The presence of sharing helped communities navigate these fluctuations, but it did not remove them entirely. Hunger could still appear during quieter periods, reminding individuals that the next opportunity for nourishment had not yet arrived. The body's ability to continue functioning during those intervals allowed the group to keep searching while relying on previously stored energy. Over long stretches of time, this pattern of shared abundance, followed by quieter periods, became woven into the social and biological fabric of human life. The landscapes where people lived continued to determine when food would appear, yet the cooperative structures within communities helped transform those moments into collective resources. In this way, the experience of eating and the experience of hunger were both shaped not only by ecological forces, but also by the social relationships that allowed human groups to endure within environments where nourishment arrived in waves rather than in constant supply. Across many generations, the pattern of uneven food availability gradually shaped not only how people ate, but also how they organized their time and expectations. When nourishment arrived in concentrated moments rather than in a steady stream, communities learned to treat those moments as opportunities that needed to be used carefully. A successful hunt or a productive gathering site could supply food for a group in ways that were immediately visible. Meat from an animal might be divided among many individuals, while collected plant foods could be processed and shared soon after they were brought back to camp. These events often brought people together, creating brief periods when nourishment and social activity overlapped. Yet these gatherings did not remove the knowledge that the environment would soon shift again, and that another search would eventually begin. In this way, the rhythm of eating became closely linked to the rhythm of movement across the landscape. When food was found, people paused to prepare and consume it. When the supply diminished, attention gradually returned to the task of locating the next source of nourishment. Archaeological traces support the idea that these cycles influenced where and how long communities stayed in particular locations. Some sites show signs of repeated use during times when nearby resources were temporarily abundant. Layers of animal bones, plant remains, and hearth ash sometimes accumulate in places where groups gathered to process and eat food. Yet many of these same sites reveal relatively short periods of occupation before activity moved elsewhere. Once the nearby resources were reduced or the season changed, the group likely travelled onward to explore other parts of their territory. This pattern reflects a broader ecological reality. Natural environments rarely produce food in perfectly stable quantities. Instead, they offer shifting opportunities that appear and disappear according to weather, plant growth, and the movements of animals. Within this dynamic setting, human communities developed a flexible relationship with nourishment. Eating did not follow rigid schedules because the landscape itself did not operate according to such schedules. Instead, the timing of meals was guided by the moments when food could actually be obtained. During these moments, the body might receive substantial nourishment. Between them, the familiar sensation of hunger could quietly return as people resumed the process of searching. The biological systems discussed earlier, energy storage, appetite regulation, and metabolic flexibility, allowed the body to function within this rhythm. When food was plentiful, the body could store some of that energy for later use. When food was less immediately available, stored energy could help support continued activity while the next opportunity was sought. This interaction between ecological patterns and biological adaptation gradually shaped a way of life that balanced abundance with patience. Hunger, within this context, was not simply a sign that something had gone wrong. It was part of the natural cycle connecting the body to the environment. The rhythm of nourishment also influenced the social atmosphere of human communities. Because food often appeared in shared moments, the act of eating became intertwined with cooperation, conversation, and the exchange of knowledge. When people gathered around a fire to cook or distribute food, they were also reinforcing relationships that helped the group function effectively. Stories, instructions, and observations about the landscape could be exchanged during these times, passing practical knowledge from one generation to the next. In this way, the uneven arrival of food may have quietly shaped aspects of human culture as well as biology. Over long periods of time, the interaction between landscape, body, and community produced a rhythm that felt familiar to those who lived within it. Food arrived when the land provided it. People gathered, shared, and nourished themselves in those moments. Then the search resumed as the environment shifted again. Within that cycle, hunger remained a gentle but persistent signal linking the needs of the human body to the changing opportunities offered by the natural world. For many thousands of years, human communities relied on hunting, gathering, and movement across landscapes to obtain their food. Eventually, in several parts of the world, people began experimenting with a different approach to nourishment. Instead of depending entirely on wild resources that appeared unpredictably, they started to cultivate certain plants and to keep animals in ways that allowed food to be produced more regularly within particular areas. This gradual transition toward agriculture began in different regions at different times, often developing slowly over many generations. The change did not occur suddenly, and it did not immediately replace earlier ways of life. For a long time, many communities combined small-scale cultivation with hunting and gathering, creating mixed systems that still relied heavily on natural ecosystems. Even when farming practices began to spread, however, the expectation that food would always be available did not suddenly become reality. Early agricultural systems introduced new possibilities for producing nourishment, but they also created new kinds of uncertainty. Crops depend on soil conditions, rainfall, temperature, and protection from pests. If these factors aligned well during a growing season, harvests could provide substantial quantities of food. If they did not, the results could be disappointing or even damaging to a community's food supply. In this way, agriculture changed the nature of food uncertainty rather than eliminating it entirely. Instead of searching widely across landscapes for scattered resources, people now depended more heavily on the success of specific fields or crops. Archaeological evidence from early farming settlements shows how these systems developed gradually. Remains of domesticated grains, such as early varieties of wheat and barley in parts of the Near East, or rice in regions of East Asia, appear in layers of soil alongside the tools used to cultivate and process them. Grinding stones become more common in these sites, reflecting the labor required to transform harvested grains into edible food. Storage pits and containers also appear, suggesting that people began preserving part of the harvest for later use. These developments mark important steps toward more stable food supplies. Yet the archaeological record also shows that early agricultural communities were still vulnerable to fluctuations in food availability. One of the most widely discussed patterns in agricultural societies is the presence of seasonal shortages, sometimes referred to as the period before a new harvest arrives. After crops have been gathered and stored, food supplies may gradually decline over the months that follow. As the next planting season progresses and the previous harvest becomes depleted, communities can experience a stretch of time when available food is limited. This pattern has been documented in historical farming societies and is thought to have occurred in earlier agricultural systems as well. During these intervals, the body's ability to adapt to reduced energy intake would once again become important. The emergence of agriculture, therefore, did not remove hunger from human experience. Instead, it transformed the timing and structure of food availability. In hunting and gathering societies, nourishment often appeared in scattered moments shaped by the natural rhythms of ecosystems. In early farming communities, food could arrive in large quantities during harvest seasons, followed by periods when stored supplies slowly diminished. The rhythm of abundance and waiting continued, though it now followed the calendar of planting and harvesting rather than the movements of wild plants and animals. Human biology, already adapted to fluctuating energy intake, remained capable of functioning within this new pattern. Anthropologists and archaeologists have also observed that early farming did not always produce diets that were more varied than those of foraging societies. In some regions, reliance on a small number of cultivated crops may have narrowed the range of foods people consumed. This change could influence health in complex ways, depending on the balance of nutrients available within the diet. Evidence from ancient skeletons sometimes reveals differences in growth patterns or dental health that appear after agriculture becomes established in certain regions. Such findings remind us that the transition to farming was not a simple shift toward abundance, but a transformation that brought both new opportunities and new challenges. Within this changing world, hunger did not disappear. It remained part of the relationship between human communities and the systems that produced their food. The land could still offer generous harvests in one season and far less in another, reminding people that nourishment continued to depend on forces beyond immediate human control. As early farming communities became more established, the connection between human life and seasonal cycles became even more visible. Unlike the scattered opportunities of hunting and gathering, cultivated crops followed a slower and more structured rhythm. Seeds were planted at certain times of the year, and the plants required weeks or months to grow before they could be harvested. During this long period of growth, the food that would eventually sustain the community remained out of reach, visible in the fields but not yet ready to eat. People had to rely on whatever reserves remained from the previous harvest or on supplementary foods gathered from the surrounding environment. In this way, the agricultural calendar introduced a new form of waiting into human life. The fields promised future nourishment, but the body still needed energy while that future slowly approached. Many historical farming societies developed a well-known pattern linked to this agricultural cycle. After the harvest season, food stores were often relatively full. Grains, dried plants, or preserved animal products could provide nourishment during the months that followed. Over time, however, those stores gradually declined. As the next planting season passed and the crops were still growing in the fields, communities sometimes experienced a period when available food was more limited. Anthropologists and historians studying traditional agricultural regions have frequently described this interval as a time when people relied more carefully on their remaining supplies or supplemented them with whatever foods could still be gathered from the landscape. These intervals varied widely depending on climate, crop type, and storage practices, but the pattern of abundance followed by gradual scarcity appears in many agricultural traditions around the world. Archaeological evidence offers indirect signs that similar rhythms may have existed in ancient farming communities. Storage pits discovered at early agricultural sites sometimes contain the remains of harvested grains or other plant foods. The presence of these storage structures suggests that people were actively planning for future periods when fresh crops would not yet be available. Grinding stones and other processing tools found nearby indicate the daily work required to turn stored grains into edible meals. At the same time, remains of wild plants and animals continue to appear in many farming settlements, suggesting that cultivated crops were often supplemented by foods gathered from forests, rivers, or grasslands. This mixture of cultivated and wild resources reveals that agriculture did not immediately eliminate dependence on natural ecosystems. Instead, early farmers often combined several strategies to ensure that their communities remained nourished throughout the year. Climate variability could further complicate this agricultural rhythm. Crops depend heavily on weather conditions, and even small changes in rainfall or temperature can influence how well plants grow. A season with favorable weather might produce an abundant harvest, filling storage spaces and providing food for many months. Another season with poor rainfall or unexpected frost could produce a much smaller yield. When harvests were reduced, the interval before the next crop matured could become more difficult for the community. In such moments, the body's ability to function during periods of limited energy intake would once again become important. The biological adaptations that developed during earlier periods of human evolution remained relevant even in agricultural settings. Human metabolism could still draw upon stored energy while people waited for new food to become available. The shift to farming therefore changed the structure of food availability without fully removing its fluctuations. Instead of following the movements of animals or the ripening of wild plants, the rhythm of nourishment now followed the slower growth of cultivated crops. Yet the essential pattern remained recognizable. Food arrived in cycles shaped by environmental conditions, and the body continued to experience intervals between moments of abundance. In this agricultural world, hunger still served as a familiar signal reminding people that the balance between stored food and future harvests required careful attention. Communities responded with planning, storage, and cooperation, but they remained aware that the land and the seasons ultimately determined when nourishment would once again fill their fields and their homes. As agricultural communities continued to develop, the relationship between people and food became increasingly connected to the long rhythms of land, climate, and stored harvests. Villages and settlements grew around fields that were planted and harvested year after year, and the success of those fields began to shape the well-being of entire populations. Yet even with these changes, the availability of nourishment remained tied to environmental conditions that humans could influence but never completely control. Crops required careful tending, fertile soil, and sufficient rainfall. If these conditions aligned well, a community might gather a harvest that could sustain many people for months. If the season unfolded differently, the same fields might yield less than expected. In this way, agriculture created a new relationship with hunger. Instead of following the movements of animals or the scattered appearance of wild plants, people now watched the growth of their crops and waited for the moment when those plants could finally be harvested. During the growing season, fields filled with green shoots represented potential nourishment that was still weeks away from becoming usable food. This waiting period could stretch across much of the year. Communities relied on stored grains and preserved foods to bridge the gap between harvests, carefully managing supplies so that they would last until the next crops were ready. The act of storing food became one of the most important innovations of agricultural life. Storage pits, clay containers, and later more complex granaries allowed people to protect harvested grains from moisture and pests. Archaeological excavations in many early farming regions have uncovered these structures, often filled with remnants of ancient crops such as wheat, barley, millet, or rice. The presence of these storage systems reveals how seriously communities treated the challenge of maintaining nourishment across the long interval between harvests. Planning and foresight became essential parts of daily life, as families and villages considered how much of their harvest could be eaten immediately and how much needed to be preserved for the months ahead. Even with careful storage, however, food supplies could still fluctuate. Crops might spoil if storage conditions were poor, or reserves might diminish more quickly if a harvest had been smaller than usual. In such circumstances, people often returned to strategies that had sustained earlier generations. Wild plants, fish, and small animals continue to supplement agricultural diets in many regions. The landscapes surrounding villages remained important sources of nourishment, particularly when stored crops were limited. This blending of farming with foraging persisted in numerous societies for long periods, illustrating how deeply human survival remained connected to the broader ecosystems beyond cultivated fields. Evidence from ancient skeletons suggests that these agricultural transitions sometimes brought mixed outcomes for human health. In some populations, the reliance on a smaller range of staple crops appears to have reduced dietary diversity compared with earlier foraging communities. Dental remains occasionally show increased signs of wear or decay associated with certain cultivated foods, and bones sometimes reveal subtle indicators of nutritional stress during childhood. These findings do not mean that agriculture was harmful overall, but they do remind us that the shift toward farming did not create an immediate world of guaranteed abundance. Instead, it introduced new patterns of dependence on seasonal harvests and stored food supplies. Through these changes, the experience of hunger continued to accompany human life, though its timing and causes evolved. The body that had developed across hundreds of thousands of years in fluctuating environments remained capable of adapting to the cycles of planting, growth, and harvest that defined agricultural societies. Hunger still functioned as a signal guiding attention toward nourishment, reminding communities that the balance between present supplies and future harvests required patience and careful management. In this agricultural landscape, As in the earlier world of hunting and gathering, the human body continued to live within rhythms set by nature. Food could be cultivated and stored, but its arrival remained part of a cycle shaped by soil, weather, and time. Within that cycle, the familiar sensation of hunger quietly persisted, linking modern farmers to the much older history of human life in environments where nourishment had always appeared in patterns that required waiting, planning, and resilience. As agricultural societies expanded across different regions of the world, a new factor began to shape the relationship between humans and food: population growth. When communities learned to cultivate crops and raise animals, they could often support more people within a given area than hunting and gathering alone had allowed. Villages gradually grew larger, and in some places they developed into towns where many families lived close to one another. With more people sharing the same landscape, the demand for food increased as well. Fields had to produce enough grain or other crops to nourish entire communities, and the balance between harvest and consumption became increasingly important. When conditions were favorable and harvests were successful, growing populations could be sustained for long periods. Yet the same growth also created new vulnerabilities when harvests did not meet expectations. In smaller mobile groups of foragers, people could sometimes respond to food scarcity by traveling to new regions where resources were more abundant. Agricultural societies were often less flexible in this way. Fields required long periods of cultivation, and villages were built around the land that communities depended upon for crops. If a harvest was reduced by drought, pests, or other environmental changes, the options for quickly relocating were limited. As a result, agricultural populations sometimes faced situations where many people depended on the success of the same fields during a particular season. Archaeological evidence from ancient settlements reveals how communities attempted to manage these challenges. Storage facilities became increasingly important as populations grew. Larger granaries and communal storage spaces appear in some archaeological sites, suggesting that people were developing ways to preserve significant quantities of food for later use. These stores could help buffer communities against short-term shortages, providing nourishment during seasons when fresh crops were not yet ready. However, storage alone could not completely eliminate the risks associated with agriculture. If several poor harvests occurred in succession, the reserves might gradually decline, leaving communities with fewer options for maintaining their food supply. Historical records from later agricultural societies show how fluctuations in harvests could influence entire populations. Years of favorable weather might produce abundant crops and allow communities to expand. In contrast, periods of drought, flooding, or crop disease could reduce yields and place pressure on food reserves. While these historical examples come from more recent times, they illustrate the kinds of environmental influences that likely affected earlier farming communities as well. Agriculture connected human nourishment more closely to the success of specific crops growing within particular regions. When those crops flourished, food supplies could be relatively secure. When they struggled, the effects could be felt across entire villages. This growing connection between population size and food production meant that hunger sometimes appeared not only as an individual experience, but also as a challenge for entire communities. If the available harvest could not meet the needs of the population, people might need to rely more heavily on stored food, trade with neighboring groups, or gather additional resources from the surrounding environment. Such responses required cooperation and planning, reinforcing the social structures that developed within agricultural societies. The human body, still shaped by its earlier evolutionary history, continued to respond to these circumstances with the same biological signals that had guided generations before. Hunger remained a reminder that energy reserves were declining, and that nourishment would soon be needed again. Even in villages surrounded by cultivated fields, the body carried within it the memory of much older landscapes where food had never been guaranteed. Archaeological studies of ancient settlements sometimes reveal subtle signs of these pressures. Variations in skeletal growth patterns or dental health can appear in populations that experienced fluctuations in food availability. These signs suggest that the balance between harvest and population was not always perfectly stable. Through such evidence, the past reveals a world where agriculture increased the potential for feeding larger communities, but did not completely remove the uncertainties that had long accompanied human life. The land still determined how much food could be produced in a given season, and human populations had to adapt continually to those changing conditions. Within this evolving relationship between people, crops, and landscapes, hunger remained a familiar signal linking the biological needs of the body to the broader ecological forces that shape the success of each harvest. As agricultural populations continued to grow, the relationship between land and nourishment became increasingly complex. Fields that once supported small villages were now expected to feed larger communities, and the amount of food that could be produced within a given area began to matter more than ever before. Farmers learned to cultivate their land carefully, planting crops in patterns that made the best use of soil and seasonal rainfall. Over generations, communities experimented with techniques such as rotating crops, preparing soil before planting, and selecting seeds from the healthiest plants. These efforts helped increase productivity in many regions. Yet even with improved knowledge, the harvest still depended on environmental conditions that remained beyond complete human control. Rainfall patterns could shift from one year to the next, temperatures could fluctuate unexpectedly, and insects or plant diseases could reduce the yield of crops that had once grown well. When populations were smaller, such variations might affect only a limited number of people. As villages expanded into larger settlements, however, the consequences of reduced harvests could reach many more individuals at the same time. This growing dependence on agricultural output created new forms of planning within communities. Food production was no longer simply an activity carried out by individuals or families, but a shared responsibility affecting the well-being of the entire population. Some societies developed systems for managing communal storage, where a portion of each harvest was kept in collective reserves. These reserves could be used during seasons when crops were still growing or when a harvest was smaller than expected. Archaeological excavations in certain regions have uncovered large storage structures capable of holding significant quantities of grain. Their size suggests that communities recognized the need to prepare for periods when food supplies might temporarily decline. At the same time, agricultural societies often remained connected to surrounding ecosystems. Even when cultivated crops formed the foundation of the diet, wild foods continued to supplement daily nourishment in many regions. People gathered fruits, hunted animals, or fished in nearby waters, especially during seasons when stored crops were limited. This combination of farming and foraging allowed communities to draw energy from multiple sources, reducing their reliance on a single harvest. In some areas, trade between neighboring settlements also helped distribute food resources more widely. If one region produced an abundance of a particular crop while another experienced a smaller yield, exchanges between communities could help balance these differences. Such interactions created networks through which food and other goods moved across landscapes. Despite these strategies, the balance between population and food supply remained delicate. If environmental conditions affected several harvests in succession, reserves could gradually diminish even when communities had planned carefully. Historical records from later agricultural civilizations illustrate how such situations sometimes led to significant social challenges. Although these records come from more recent times, they offer insight into the kinds of pressures that may also have affected earlier farming societies. The underlying lesson is that food production, even when organized through agriculture, still depended on natural systems that could vary from year to year. The human body, shaped by a much older evolutionary history, continued to respond to these fluctuations with familiar biological signals. Hunger did not disappear simply because crops were planted in fields. Instead, it remained part of the ongoing relationship between people and the landscapes that sustained them. When harvests were plentiful, communities could enjoy periods of relative abundance. When conditions were less favorable, the body once again relied on its ability to function during intervals of reduced energy intake, while people searched for additional resources or waited for the next harvest. Across generations, agricultural societies learned to navigate this balance between population, production, and environmental change. Their efforts illustrate how the challenge of obtaining food did not end with the introduction of farming, but instead evolved into a new set of questions about how much land could produce, how many people it could support, and how communities could prepare for the times when nature offered less than expected. As agricultural societies continued to evolve, the connection between population size and food production became one of the central forces shaping human history. Communities learned that the land surrounding them could support only a certain number of people depending on how much food it produced each year. When harvests were abundant and fields yielded generous crops, Villages often grew larger as families expanded and new households were established. These periods of stability allowed communities to build homes, develop traditions, and pass knowledge from one generation to the next. Yet the same growth also meant that more people depended on the same soil, the same rainfall, and the same cycle of planting and harvesting. When environmental conditions changed, the balance between population and food supply could shift quickly. Archaeological studies of ancient settlements sometimes reveal these changes through variations in the size and organization of communities over time. In certain regions, periods of expansion are visible in the form of larger villages and more numerous dwellings. In later layers of the same sites, researchers sometimes observe signs that populations declined or that settlements were partially abandoned. These patterns can occur for many reasons, but one factor often considered by archaeologists is the relationship between food production and the number of people relying on it. If crops failed repeatedly, or if land became less productive after many years of cultivation, communities might need to reduce their population size or relocate to areas where conditions were more favorable. Such adjustments remind us that agriculture increased the ability of humans to produce food, but it did not remove the environmental limits that shaped how much nourishment the land could provide. The delicate balance between people and resources also encouraged the development of social systems that helped communities respond to change. Leaders, councils, or other forms of organization sometimes played a role in coordinating planting schedules, managing shared storage, or distributing food during difficult seasons. These arrangements varied widely between cultures, yet they all reflect a recognition that food supply was a matter affecting the entire group. Cooperation remained essential, just as it had been during earlier periods of hunting and gathering. The difference was that the focus of cooperation had shifted toward managing fields, harvests, and stored crops rather than following migrating animals across open landscapes. Even with such organization, the experience of hunger could still emerge during years when environmental conditions reduced agricultural output. Drought, flooding, or the spread of plant diseases could affect crops across large areas, leaving communities with smaller harvests than expected. When such events occurred, people often relied on the same adaptive strategies that had helped earlier generations survive within uncertain ecosystems. They gathered wild foods from forests or rivers, traded with neighboring communities, or drew upon stored reserves until conditions improved. The persistence of these strategies illustrates how deeply human survival remained connected to the broader environment, even after the adoption of agriculture. The human body also continued to reflect this long evolutionary history. The biological systems that regulate hunger and energy storage had developed long before farming began, and they remained capable of guiding behavior during periods when food supplies were reduced. Hunger signaled the need for nourishment while the body drew upon its reserves, allowing individuals to remain active while communities worked together to restore balance between people and resources. Over time, these biological and social adaptations helped agricultural societies endure the fluctuations that accompanied life on cultivated land. The story revealed through archaeology, therefore, suggests a gradual transformation rather than a sudden solution. Agriculture expanded the possibilities for feeding larger populations, yet it also introduced new dependencies on climate, soil, and the success of harvests. Human communities responded with planning, cooperation, and innovation, but they continued to live within ecological limits that could not always be predicted. Within this evolving relationship between land and population, hunger remained a familiar signal reminding people that the search for nourishment, whether in fields, forests, or distant trade routes, was still an essential part of human life. Throughout human history, cooperation has played a central role in helping communities navigate the uncertainty of food availability. Long before agriculture created villages and fields, people had already learned that sharing resources could reduce the risks associated with searching for nourishment in unpredictable environments. When one person succeeded in gathering plant foods or capturing an animal, the result often benefited many others in the group. This pattern of sharing was not simply an act of generosity. It was a practical strategy that allowed human communities to endure the natural fluctuations of ecosystems where food could appear one day and become scarce the next. By distributing resources across the group, people created a buffer against the uneven outcomes of hunting, gathering, and later farming. Anthropological observations of foraging societies in different parts of the world suggest that sharing food has deep roots in human behavior. In many of these communities, a successful hunt does not result in the hunter keeping the entire animal. Instead, the meat is divided among families or distributed throughout the group according to established customs. These customs vary between cultures, but they often reflect a common understanding. Success in obtaining food is rarely predictable, and sharing increases the chances that everyone will receive nourishment over time. On one day, a hunter might return with a large animal that can feed many people. On another day, the same hunter may return empty-handed and rely on food gathered or hunted by others. Over time, this exchange creates a system where the fortunes of individuals are balanced by the contributions of the group. The development of agriculture did not remove the importance of this cooperative approach. Instead, it shifted the focus of cooperation toward new tasks related to cultivating and managing food resources. Planting crops, maintaining irrigation channels, and harvesting fields often required coordinated effort among many people. In some communities, large groups worked together during planting and harvest seasons, helping ensure that the crops were gathered before they spoiled or were damaged by weather. Shared labor allowed communities to complete tasks more efficiently than individuals working alone. Once the harvest was collected, systems of distribution and storage helped ensure that food was available for families throughout the year. Archaeological evidence from ancient settlements often reveals structures that suggest communal management of food supplies. Large storage areas, granaries, and shared processing spaces appear in some early farming communities. These features indicate that people were not only producing food individually, but also organizing collective strategies to protect and distribute it. In certain societies, portions of the harvest may have been stored for communal use during difficult seasons, reflecting a continuation of the cooperative principles that had guided earlier foraging groups. Even when families managed their own fields or food stores, social ties within the community often helped provide support during times when individual supplies became limited. Cooperation also influenced how knowledge about food was shared within human groups. Elders and experienced members of the community often played important roles in teaching younger generations how to identify edible plants, track animals, prepare food safely, and understand seasonal changes in the landscape. This transfer of knowledge allowed communities to maintain a collective memory of where nourishment could be found and how it could be obtained. The human brain, with its ability to communicate complex ideas through language, helped preserve and transmit this information across generations. Through stories, instruction, and daily practice, communities built a shared understanding of the environments that sustained them. Within these networks of cooperation and knowledge, hunger continued to serve as a signal guiding attention toward nourishment. The body reminded individuals when energy was needed, while the community provided the social structure that helped address that need. By sharing resources, coordinating labor, and passing knowledge across generations, human societies created systems that allowed them to endure within landscapes where food was never perfectly predictable. In this way, cooperation became one of the most important tools humans developed for living in a world where hunger remained a natural part of the human experience. As cooperation became more deeply woven into human communities, it began to influence not only how food was shared, but also how people organized their daily lives around the task of obtaining nourishment. The search for food was rarely an individual effort carried out in isolation. Instead, it often involved a coordinated pattern of roles within the group. Some individuals traveled farther across the landscape to hunt animals or locate distant food sources, while others focused on gathering plant foods, preparing meals, maintaining tools, or caring for children. This distribution of tasks allowed communities to use their time and energy more efficiently, while ensuring that the many activities required for survival were completed. The pattern did not necessarily follow rigid rules, and it likely varied widely between cultures and environments. Yet the underlying principle remained consistent. Cooperation increased the chances that a group could obtain and prepare the food it needed. Archaeological evidence offers subtle clues about how these cooperative systems functioned in the past. Sites associated with ancient communities sometimes contain specialized tools linked to particular tasks. Stone blades used for cutting meat, grinding stones for processing grains or seeds, and containers for storing food all appear together in areas where people lived and worked collectively. The presence of such tools suggests that food preparation and consumption were not isolated activities, but part of a shared environment where multiple individuals contributed to the process. Hearths found in many archaeological sites also point toward communal spaces where food was cooked and eaten. These fires were not only sources of warmth and light, but also places where people gathered to prepare meals and share them with others in the group. Over time, these cooperative activities helped shape the social fabric of human communities. When people gathered around a fire to cook or distribute food, they also created opportunities for communication and learning. Knowledge about where certain plants grew, how animals moved through the landscape, or how weather patterns changed across seasons could be exchanged during these moments. Such information was essential for improving the success of future food searches. Younger members of the community could observe and learn from older individuals who had accumulated experience over many years. In this way, the search for nourishment became closely linked with the transmission of cultural knowledge. The human capacity for language made it possible to describe places, seasons, and techniques in ways that allowed information to travel beyond the immediate moment. Stories about past hunts, successful harvests, or dangerous plants could guide the decisions of future generations. Cooperation also allowed communities to respond more effectively when food supplies became limited. If one family experienced a poor harvest or an unsuccessful hunting period, others within the group might offer assistance by sharing part of their own food. These acts were often supported by social expectations that encouraged reciprocity. Individuals understood that helping others during difficult times increased the likelihood that they themselves would receive help when circumstances changed. Such arrangements did not eliminate scarcity, but they softened its impact and allowed communities to remain stable during periods of environmental uncertainty. Within this cooperative framework, hunger continued to play a guiding role. The sensation of hunger reminded individuals that the body required energy, prompting renewed attention to the tasks of gathering, hunting, or preparing food. Yet the response to that signal rarely depended on a single person acting alone. Instead, it activated a network of relationships through which people worked together to obtain nourishment. The fields of farmers, the paths of hunters, the baskets of gathered plants, and the shared fires where meals were prepared, all formed part of a larger system sustained by cooperation. Through these interconnected efforts, human communities developed a way of life that balanced biological needs with social organization. The body signaled the need for food, and the community responded through coordinated action. In this relationship between hunger and cooperation, we can see how the challenge of obtaining nourishment helped shape not only the survival of individuals, but also the structures that allowed human societies to flourish across many different environments. Over long stretches of time, the cooperative systems that developed around food gradually shaped the deeper structure of human communities. The need to obtain, prepare, and distribute nourishment encouraged people to remain connected with one another in ways that extended beyond immediate survival. Food was rarely only a private resource. It often existed within a network of relationships where families, neighbors, and entire groups participated in the processes that allowed nourishment to reach each member of the community. These patterns did not emerge suddenly. Instead, they formed slowly across generations, as people learned that cooperation increased stability in environments where food could appear unpredictably or decline during certain seasons. The repeated experience of searching for food, sharing it, and preparing it together created traditions that were passed down over time. In many communities, the act of eating together became one of the most consistent moments when social bonds were reinforced. Archaeological evidence suggests that shared spaces for preparing food were common features of human settlements. Hearths, cooking areas, and communal working spaces often appear near the center of ancient habitation sites. Around these fires, people could roast meat, boil plant foods, or grind grains into forms that were easier to digest. These activities required time and attention, drawing individuals into collective routines where food preparation became part of daily life. The presence of multiple tools and cooking residues in these areas suggests that many people contributed to the process, transforming raw resources gathered from the landscape into meals that could nourish the entire group. These shared tasks also created opportunities for communication and observation. While food was being prepared, individuals could exchange information about the environment beyond the settlement. Hunters might describe the movements of animals across distant valleys, while gatherers could explain which plants were ripening in nearby forests or fields. Such knowledge was essential for planning future searches for nourishment. Younger members of the community often learned by watching these conversations and participating in the routines of food preparation. In this way, practical knowledge about survival became woven into everyday activities surrounding meals. The simple act of sharing food thus carried educational as well as nutritional importance. Within this social framework, hunger continued to serve as an underlying signal guiding the actions of both individuals and communities. When the body indicated that energy was needed, people turned their attention toward the systems that had been built to meet that need. Fields were tended, tools were prepared, and journeys were organized to gather or hunt the next supply of food. These responses rarely occurred in isolation. Instead, they unfolded through the coordinated efforts of many individuals working together toward a common goal. Cooperation allowed communities to respond more effectively to the natural variability of food sources while maintaining social stability during times when resources were limited. The long history of these cooperative systems helps explain why food remains such a powerful element of human culture even today. Meals continue to bring people together in homes, markets, and public gatherings across the world. Although the environments and technologies that provide food have changed dramatically, the social patterns surrounding nourishment still reflect ancient habits formed during much earlier stages of human history. Sharing food, preparing it collectively, and gathering around a common place to eat remain familiar experiences in many societies. These traditions echo the deeper past when cooperation around food helped human communities endure uncertain landscapes where nourishment was never guaranteed. Through these shared efforts, the sensation of hunger became more than a biological signal. It became part of a larger relationship linking the needs of the body with the structures of community. The body requested energy, and the group responded through knowledge, labor, and mutual support. Over countless generations, this interaction shaped the rhythms of daily life, reinforcing the understanding that the search for nourishment was not only an individual task, but also a collective endeavor that allowed human societies to survive and adapt within a changing world. For most of human history, the amount of food available to a community was closely connected to the limits of the surrounding landscape. Long before modern systems of transportation and global trade existed, people depended primarily on the resources that could be produced or gathered within the environments where they lived. Fields, forests, rivers, and grasslands formed the foundation of nourishment. Each of these environments offered its own possibilities, but they also imposed boundaries on how much food could be obtained. The fertility of soil, the availability of water, the movement of animals, and the seasonal growth of plants all influenced how much nourishment the land could provide at any given time. These ecological limits were not always visible in a single day or even a single season, yet over longer periods they shaped the rhythm of human life in quiet but powerful ways. Archaeological studies of ancient settlements reveal how closely communities were tied to the productivity of their landscapes. In regions where fertile soil and reliable rainfall supported productive agriculture, villages often remained in the same locations for long periods. Fields could be cultivated year after year, and harvests provided the foundation for stable populations. In other regions where soil conditions were less favorable or rainfall was more variable, communities sometimes moved more frequently or relied on a wider range of food sources. These patterns illustrate how the availability of nourishment was deeply influenced by environmental conditions that could not be fully controlled by human effort alone. Even when people developed farming techniques, irrigation systems, and tools to improve productivity, the broader ecological context continued to play a decisive role. Soil fertility, for example, gradually changes over time as crops are grown and nutrients are removed from the land. Without careful management, fields can become less productive after many years of cultivation. Ancient farmers in different parts of the world learned various methods to address this challenge, such as allowing fields to rest for a period of time or planting different crops in rotation. These practices helped maintain the balance between soil health and food production, yet they also reveal how closely agriculture remained connected to natural cycles that unfolded over many seasons. The land could be guided and improved, but it could never be separated entirely from the environmental processes that shaped its productivity. Water availability presented another crucial factor influencing how much food could be produced. Crops require sufficient moisture to grow, and rainfall patterns vary widely between regions and across different years. In some agricultural societies, Irrigation channels were constructed to bring water from rivers to cultivated fields, helping farmers maintain crops during dry periods. Archaeological remains of these irrigation systems can still be found in several ancient farming regions. Yet even with such systems in place, extreme changes in climate could still affect agricultural success. Floods might damage crops in one season, while drought could reduce harvests in another. These environmental fluctuations meant that the amount of food produced by the land remained subject to forces beyond immediate human control. Within this context, the experience of hunger continued to accompany human life as a reminder of these ecological limits. Even when fields were carefully planted and tended, the harvest depended on conditions that unfolded slowly across the seasons. The human body, with its long evolutionary history and fluctuating environments, remained capable of functioning within these cycles. Hunger signaled when energy reserves were declining, encouraging individuals and communities to pay attention to the timing of harvests, the management of stored food, and the search for additional resources in the surrounding landscape. In this way, the relationship between people and food remained inseparable from the land itself. The soil, the water, and the changing seasons quietly shaped how much nourishment could be produced and how reliably it could reach the people who depended upon it. Through this enduring connection, the limits of the environment continued to guide the rhythms of human life, reminding communities that the search for food was always linked to the deeper ecological systems that sustained the world around them. Across long periods of history, the relationship between human communities and their surrounding landscapes required careful attention to the natural limits of the environment. Even when agriculture allowed people to cultivate crops in familiar places year after year, the land itself continued to follow rhythms that unfolded gradually through time. Soil nutrients could diminish after repeated planting, rainfall could vary between seasons, and rivers might shift their patterns across decades. These changes were often subtle in the short term, but over longer stretches they could influence how productive fields remained and how much food communities were able to obtain from the same land. In many regions, ancient farmers developed practices that reflected an understanding of these slow environmental processes. Instead of planting the same crop in the same field every year, some communities alternated between different plants or allowed sections of land to rest for a time. This practice, sometimes called fallowing, gave soil an opportunity to recover some of the nutrients that crops had removed. Archaeological studies of ancient agricultural landscapes have revealed signs of such practices in different parts of the world. Patterns of pollen, plant remains, and soil composition preserved in layers of earth can show that fields were used in cycles rather than continuously. These observations suggest that early farmers recognized, through experience, that the productivity of land depended on allowing natural processes to restore balance over time. Water management also became an important aspect of maintaining agricultural stability. In areas where rainfall alone could not reliably support crops, people sometimes created systems to guide water toward cultivated fields. Irrigation channels, small dams, or carefully shaped terraces helped direct water across the land so that plants could grow more consistently. Archaeologists have discovered remnants of such systems in ancient farming regions, indicating that communities invested significant effort in managing the movement of water. Yet even these carefully designed systems were influenced by the larger patterns of climate and weather. Periods of extended drought could reduce the flow of rivers, while unusually heavy rains could damage fields or erode soil. These events remind us that agricultural success remained closely connected to environmental conditions that unfolded beyond the control of any single community. As people observed these patterns over generations, they developed cultural knowledge that helped guide agricultural decisions. Elders might remember which areas of land remained fertile for longer periods, which crops grew best under certain conditions, or when seasonal rains typically arrived. This knowledge, passed through observation and experience rather than written records, allowed communities to adjust their planting strategies in ways that increased the chances of successful harvests. The human ability to share information through language played a crucial role in preserving these lessons across generations. By describing past seasons and environmental changes, communities could prepare more effectively for the uncertainties that lay ahead. Even with such knowledge, however, agriculture remained tied to the broader ecological systems that shaped the productivity of the land. Crops could flourish in one year and struggle in another depending on weather, soil conditions, or the presence of pests. These fluctuations meant that food availability could still vary across seasons and across years. The human body, shaped by a long evolutionary past in environments where nourishment was never perfectly predictable, continued to respond to these variations with familiar signals. Hunger reminded individuals that the balance between energy intake and the body's needs required constant attention. In agricultural communities, that attention often took the form of planning harvests carefully, managing stored food wisely, and remaining aware of the subtle environmental signs that indicated how the next growing season might unfold. Through these practices, human societies attempted to live in partnership with the landscapes that sustained them. The land could offer nourishment, but only within the boundaries set by natural processes that operated slowly and sometimes unpredictably. Recognizing these limits became part of the long relationship between humans and their environment, shaping the strategies that communities used to ensure that food continued to reach those who depended upon it. Over generations of observation and experience, human communities gradually learned that the landscapes sustaining them were not static environments, but living systems that changed slowly across time. Soil, water, plants, and animals formed interconnected networks that responded to weather patterns, seasonal cycles, and the cumulative effects of human activity. Even when agriculture allowed people to remain in the same region for long periods, the productivity of the land still depended on these broader ecological relationships. Fields that once produced reliable harvests could become less fertile if nutrients were depleted. Rivers that provided water to crops might shift their flow or change with variations in rainfall. Forests that once offered additional food resources could thin as communities expanded their cultivated areas. Each of these changes unfolded gradually, often becoming visible only after many seasons had passed. Archaeological studies sometimes reveal these long-term shifts through the traces left behind in soil layers and plant remains. In certain regions, evidence suggests that ancient farmers adjusted their settlements or cultivation patterns as environmental conditions evolved. Fields might be moved to new areas where soil remained fertile, or farming methods could be modified to better match the changing landscape. These adjustments reflect a continuous process of learning in which communities responded to the signals provided by the environment. People observed how crops responded to rainfall, how soil behaved after repeated planting, and how nearby ecosystems changed as human activity increased. Through this ongoing dialogue with the land, societies developed practical knowledge that helped them maintain nourishment within ecological limits. Water remained one of the most influential elements in this relationship. The availability of moisture determined not only whether crops could grow, but also how resilient they were during difficult seasons. In some regions, the construction of irrigation channels allowed farmers to guide river water across fields, extending the growing season and supporting larger harvests. Yet, irrigation systems themselves required careful maintenance. Sediment could accumulate in channels, and floods could damage the structures designed to direct water. Maintaining these systems demanded coordinated effort from many members of the community. Their presence illustrates how deeply human survival had become linked with managing the delicate balance between natural forces and agricultural needs. Even with careful planning and shared labor, however, communities remained aware that environmental conditions could still change in ways that influence food production. Extended droughts, unusually cold seasons, or sudden storms could alter the expected outcome of a harvest. In such moments, people often turned again to strategies that had existed long before agriculture. Wild plants, fish, and animals continued to serve as supplementary sources of nourishment in many regions. The landscapes beyond cultivated fields remained important partners in sustaining human life, reminding communities that their survival depended on a wide network of ecological relationships. The human body, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years in fluctuating environments, remained capable of navigating these variations. Hunger continued to function as a quiet signal that energy reserves were declining and that attention needed to return to the search for nourishment. The biological systems regulating appetite, metabolism, and energy storage allowed individuals to remain active even when food supplies were temporarily reduced. These adaptations connected agricultural societies to the much deeper evolutionary past in which the human body had learned to survive within uncertain ecosystems. Through this long history, a consistent pattern emerges. Whether people relied on hunting, gathering, or farming, The availability of food remained closely tied to the dynamics of the natural world. The land could offer generous harvests, but it also followed rhythms that unfolded according to climate, soil, and seasonal change. Human communities responded with knowledge, cooperation, and adaptation, yet they always remained part of the larger ecological systems that shaped how much nourishment could be produced. In this enduring relationship between people and environment, hunger persisted as a familiar reminder that the balance between human needs and the productivity of the land required patience, attention, and respect for the limits of the natural world. As human societies continued to change through history, the ways people obtained food gradually became more complex. Agriculture expanded across many regions, villages grew into towns, and trade routes began to connect distant communities. Through these connections, food could sometimes travel far beyond the landscapes where it was originally produced. Grains grown in one region might eventually appear in another through exchange, and preserved foods could be carried along rivers or across land by travelers and merchants. These networks slowly increased the range of resources available to certain populations, allowing some communities to rely not only on the productivity of their immediate surroundings but also on connections with other regions. Yet even as trade developed, the underlying relationship between humans and food remained deeply connected to natural systems. Every grain of wheat, every fruit, and every animal product still began its journey within soil, water, sunlight, and ecological cycles that operated far beyond human control. Trade could redistribute food after it was produced, but it could not remove the environmental conditions that determined whether harvests were plentiful or limited in the first place. If drought affected a region where crops were grown, the supply of food available for trade could also decline. In this way, even growing networks of exchange remained linked to the same ecological foundations that had shaped human nourishment for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence reveals how these networks gradually expanded over time. Remains of foods that originated in distant regions sometimes appear in settlements far from the environments where those foods were first cultivated. For example, certain grains or plant varieties that developed in one area later appear in archaeological layers many hundreds of kilometers away. These findings suggest that people were exchanging seeds, crops, and knowledge across significant distances. Alongside these exchanges, technologies for preserving food also improved. Drying, fermenting, and storing certain foods allowed them to travel farther without spoiling, making it possible for communities to maintain supplies over longer periods. These developments represent important steps in the long history of human attempts to manage the uncertainty of food availability. At the same time, the spread of trade did not eliminate the experience of hunger. Many communities remained primarily dependent on the food they produced locally, particularly in regions where long-distance exchange was limited. Even in places connected by trade networks, food could still become scarce if environmental conditions reduced harvests across several regions at once. Historical records from later agricultural civilizations sometimes describe years when poor harvests led to widespread shortages despite the presence of trade routes. Such examples illustrate how deeply food production remained rooted in environmental conditions that could not always be predicted or controlled. Within these evolving societies, the human body continued to respond to fluctuations in food availability in ways that had been shaped long before agriculture or trade existed. Hunger remained a biological signal guiding attention toward nourishment, reminding individuals that energy reserves were declining and that new food would soon be required. The body's ability to store energy during times of abundance and draw upon those reserves during periods of scarcity allowed people to continue functioning within environments where food supply still varied from season to season. Even as communities became more connected through trade and agriculture, these ancient biological systems continued to operate quietly within every individual. The expansion of exchange networks therefore changed the pathways through which food traveled, but it did not fully transform the deeper relationship between humans and nourishment. Food still emerged from landscapes shaped by climate, soil, and sunlight. Communities still relied on harvests that followed seasonal rhythms, and environmental changes could still influence how much food was available across entire regions. In this broader context, hunger remained part of the ongoing dialogue between the human body and the natural world. It reminded people that, despite growing social complexity and expanding trade, the origins of nourishment continued to lie within ecological systems that had sustained human life since its earliest beginnings. As trade networks gradually expanded across regions, they created new connections between communities that had once depended almost entirely on the landscapes immediately surrounding them. Rivers became pathways along which boats could carry grains, dried fish, or preserved fruits. Overland, travelers and merchants transported sacks of grain, bundles of herbs, or animals raised in distant pastures. These movements of food did not happen suddenly or everywhere at once. Instead, they developed slowly as societies learned how to travel longer distances, build vessels capable of carrying goods, and establish relationships of exchange with neighboring groups. Through these connections, certain communities gained access to foods that had once been limited to distant environments. Yet even as these networks grew, the production of food itself remained grounded in local ecosystems. Fields still depended on fertile soil and rainfall, orchards still required seasons of growth, and animals still needed pasture and water. Trade could move food from one place to another after it had been harvested, but it could not produce nourishment without the support of these underlying environmental conditions. If crops failed in the regions where they were grown, fewer goods could travel along the trade routes that connected distant communities. In this way, the wider distribution of food remained tied to the same ecological foundations that had shaped human nourishment since the earliest stages of history. Archaeological discoveries provide important clues about how these systems functioned in the past. Remains of storage vessels, transport containers, and preserved foods have been found in sites located far from the environments where those foods originally developed. In some settlements, seeds from crops that were first cultivated in distant regions appear alongside local plant remains, suggesting that farmers were experimenting with new varieties introduced through exchange. These discoveries illustrate how trade networks allowed knowledge about food production to travel as well as the food itself. Farmers could learn about crops that grew well in other climates, gradually adapting them to new landscapes where conditions permitted. Over time, this exchange of seeds and techniques contributed to the diversity of agricultural systems in many parts of the world. Even with these expanding connections, however, the experience of food availability remained closely linked to the timing of harvests and the conditions of each growing season. Trade could help distribute surplus food from regions with abundant harvests to areas experiencing temporary shortages, but this balance was not always perfect. Transportation required time and labor, and the amount of food that could be moved was limited by the technologies available at the time. If environmental conditions affected multiple regions simultaneously, the supply available for exchange could decline across entire networks. Historical examples from later agricultural societies demonstrate that widespread droughts or crop failures could still influence large populations despite the presence of trade routes. These events reveal how deeply the production of nourishment remained embedded in environmental systems that operated on a scale far larger than individual communities. The human body continued to respond to these fluctuations in familiar ways. Hunger served as a quiet signal indicating that energy stores were diminishing and that nourishment would soon be required again. Even as societies became more complex and food traveled across longer distances, the biological systems regulating appetite and metabolism remained essentially the same as those that had evolved during much earlier periods of human history. These systems allowed individuals to function through periods when food was less immediately available while communities worked to obtain new supplies. In this sense, the expansion of trade networks did not erase the deeper rhythms that had long governed the relationship between humans and food. Instead, it added another layer of connection between landscapes, communities, and the movement of nourishment across the world. Beneath these expanding networks, the fundamental process remained unchanged. Food still began with sunlight, soil, water, and the slow growth of living organisms. From those origins, it traveled through human hands, fields, markets, and trade routes before eventually reaching the people who depended upon it. Hunger, in turn, continued to link the needs of the human body to this long chain of environmental and social relationships. As trade networks continued to connect distant regions, the movement of food gradually became part of a larger system linking landscapes, communities, and seasons. Crops harvested in one place could travel along rivers, across plains, or through mountain passages before reaching people who had never seen the fields where those plants originally grew. Salted fish from coastal waters might be carried inland, while grains from fertile valleys could move toward regions where agriculture was more difficult. These exchanges expanded the variety of foods available to certain populations and allowed communities to rely on more than the immediate productivity of their own land. Yet the path that food travelled from field to table remained long and fragile, dependent on many steps that could be affected by weather, distance, and the labour required to transport it. Even in societies where trade had become well established, most food still began its journey close to the communities that consumed it. Fields were planted near villages, animals grazed in nearby pastures, and seasonal harvests continued to determine the rhythm of nourishment. Trade routes often supplemented these local supplies rather than replacing them entirely. When harvests were successful, surplus food could move outward through exchange networks, providing nourishment for people living far away. When harvests were smaller, however, the amount of food available for trade also declined. In this way, the movement of food across regions remained closely tied to the productivity of the land where it was first produced. Archaeological evidence illustrates this relationship through the materials discovered in ancient settlements. Storage vessels, transport containers, and preserved food remains show how communities attempted to extend the life of harvested crops and carry them over longer distances. Techniques such as drying, fermenting, or storing grains in sealed containers helped prevent food from spoiling during travel or during the months between harvests. These methods represent practical solutions developed by generations of people who understood that the timing of nourishment did not always align perfectly with the timing of human need. By preserving food, communities created a bridge between the moment of harvest and the later moments when that nourishment would finally be consumed. Still, even the most careful systems of storage and exchange could not fully remove the influence of environmental change. If unfavorable weather reduced harvests across several regions at once, the amount of food moving along trade routes could decrease significantly. Historical accounts from later agricultural societies sometimes describe years when drought or flooding affected crops in multiple areas simultaneously. During such times, communities often faced challenges obtaining enough food despite the presence of trade networks. These events remind us that the deeper source of nourishment remained rooted in ecological processes that unfolded across entire landscapes. The expansion of trade altered how food was distributed, but it did not change the fundamental dependence on soil, water, sunlight, and the biological growth of plants and animals. Within this interconnected system, the human body continued to respond to food availability through biological signals that had evolved much earlier in human history. Hunger remained the quiet reminder that energy was needed, guiding individuals and communities to pay attention to the pathways through which nourishment traveled. When food arrived through harvest, storage, or exchange, the body received the energy required to continue daily life. When those pathways slowed or diminished, the body relied on its ability to draw upon stored energy while people worked to obtain new supplies. These responses connected the modern experience of eating to the much older history of human survival in environments where food had never been guaranteed. Across the centuries, the expansion of trade networks gradually widened the distance between the origin of food and the people who consumed it. Yet the deeper pattern remained recognizable. Food still began in the living landscapes of the earth, passed through the efforts of farmers, gatherers, and travelers, and finally reached the communities who depended upon it. Through every stage of that journey, hunger continued to link the needs of the human body with the long chain of environmental and social relationships that made nourishment possible. As human societies entered more recent centuries, the systems that produced and distributed food gradually expanded beyond the scale of villages and regional trade networks. Improvements in transportation, storage, and agricultural technology allowed food to move across far greater distances than had been possible in earlier times. Crops grown in one part of the world could eventually reach populations living far away, sometimes traveling across oceans or through extensive land routes. These developments increased the total amount of food available to many communities and made it possible for large cities to sustain populations far removed from the fields where their nourishment was produced. At first glance, such changes might seem to suggest that the long history of human hunger was finally coming to an end. Yet a closer look reveals that even these modern systems remain connected to the same environmental foundations that have always shaped the availability of food. Modern agriculture relies on soil, water, sunlight, and biological growth in much the same way as earlier farming systems did. What has changed is the scale at which these resources are organized and transported. Large agricultural regions now produce enormous quantities of grain, vegetables, and animal products that can be distributed through complex networks of roads, ships, and storage facilities. Refrigeration and preservation techniques allow many foods to travel long distances without spoiling, extending the time between harvest and consumption. These developments have created a global network through which nourishment can circulate more widely than at any previous point in human history. Even so, the production of food still begins within living ecosystems that follow natural rhythms. Crops continue to depend on seasonal cycles, rainfall patterns, and the fertility of the soil. Livestock still require pasture, water, and suitable climates in which to grow. If environmental conditions affect these foundational systems, the consequences can extend across entire supply networks. A drought that reduces grain harvests in a major agricultural region can influence food availability far beyond the fields where the crops were grown. In this way, the global movement of food remains closely connected to the productivity of the landscapes where it originates. Scientific studies of agriculture and climate often emphasize how sensitive crop production can be to environmental variation. Temperature, soil moisture, and the presence of pollinating insects all influence how well plants grow and how much food they ultimately produce. Farmers today use many tools to manage these factors, including irrigation systems, improved crop varieties, and knowledge gained through agricultural science. These methods can help stabilize production under many conditions. Yet they do not completely remove the influence of weather and climate, which continue to shape agricultural outcomes from one season to the next. The history of agriculture, therefore, reveals a gradual process of adaptation rather than a final solution to the challenge of obtaining food. The expansion of global trade and modern farming techniques has increased the capacity to produce and distribute nourishment on an unprecedented scale. However, the biological and environmental processes underlying food production remain fundamentally similar to those that sustained human communities thousands of years ago. The energy stored in crops still begins with sunlight captured by plants. Water still moves through soils and rivers to nourish fields. Animals still convert plant energy into forms that humans can consume. Beneath the complexity of modern supply networks, the essential relationship between humans and the natural world continues to guide how food is created. Within this system, the human body still responds to nourishment and scarcity through biological signals that evolved long before modern agriculture existed. Hunger remains the body's quiet message that energy is required. Even in a world where food can travel across continents, this signal connects each person to the long history of human survival in environments where nourishment was never entirely guaranteed. The presence of global food systems has changed how communities respond to that signal, allowing food to reach people through vast networks of production and distribution. Yet the deeper relationship between hunger, human biology, and the ecological foundations of food continues to link the present with the distant past. As global systems for producing and distributing food continue to expand, the experience of nourishment became increasingly separated from the places where food was originally grown. In earlier periods of history, most people lived close to the landscapes that provided their meals. Farmers worked in fields near their homes, and hunters or gatherers traveled through environments they understood well. The connection between food and land was visible in everyday life. People could see the crops growing, observe the animals that would eventually become food, and recognize the seasonal changes that influenced when nourishment would arrive. In more recent centuries, however, the growth of cities and long-distance trade gradually changed this relationship. Large numbers of people began living in places where the fields producing their food were no longer within sight. Instead, nourishment arrived through markets, storage facilities, and transportation networks that carried crops from distant agricultural regions into urban centers. This transformation made it possible for cities to support populations far larger than the surrounding land alone could sustain. Yet it also created a new distance between individuals and the ecological processes that produced their food. Many people no longer witnessed the slow growth of crops or the seasonal rhythms that determined harvest times. Instead, food appeared as finished products ready for consumption, often without any visible trace of the landscapes where it began. Despite this growing distance, the fundamental processes that create food have remained unchanged. Crops still depend on sunlight, soil nutrients, and water moving through natural cycles. Animals still grow by consuming plants that draw energy from the environment. Even when modern technology improves efficiency, these biological foundations continue to shape how much food can be produced in any given season. The large agricultural regions that supply global food systems remain deeply connected to climate patterns, soil conditions, and ecological balance. When these environmental factors change, the effects can ripple outward through the networks that distribute food to distant communities. Agricultural scientists and farmers work constantly to understand and manage these influences. Improved crop varieties, irrigation systems, and soil management techniques have allowed many regions to produce more food than in previous generations. These developments have played an important role in supporting the growth of global populations. At the same time, they also highlight how closely modern food production remains linked to environmental conditions. Crops still require the right combination of temperature, moisture, and fertile soil to grow successfully. If any of these elements shift significantly, harvests can change as well. Because food now travels across large distances, variations in production within one region can influence availability in many other places. This interconnected system reflects both the achievements and the continuing challenges of modern agriculture. Within these expanding networks, the human body still experiences hunger in the same way it did long before cities or trade routes existed. The sensation arises when energy reserves decline, and the body signals that nourishment is needed again. Although food may now arrive through supermarkets or distribution systems rather than through hunting or harvesting, the biological mechanism behind hunger has not changed. It remains part of the ancient metabolic system that evolved when human survival depended directly on locating food within unpredictable environments. This continuity reveals an important truth about the relationship between modern life and human biology. Technological and social systems may transform how food moves through the world, but the body still carries the evolutionary memory of earlier landscapes where nourishment could never be assumed. Hunger, therefore, continues to link modern humans with the long history of their species. It reminds each individual, in a quiet and persistent way, that the search for energy and nourishment remains one of the most fundamental aspects of being alive. Even within complex global food systems, that simple biological signal continues to connect the present moment with a much older story of human adaptation to environments where food arrived through cycles of growth, harvest, and waiting. As modern food systems continued to expand, another quiet transformation began to appear in human life. For most of the past, the effort required to obtain nourishment had been a constant part of daily activity. People walked long distances across landscapes, searched for edible plants, tracked animals, prepared tools, and later cultivated fields that demanded careful labor across many seasons. The body's energy was closely connected to the work required to obtain food. Movement, effort, and the search for nourishment were woven together within the same rhythm of life. In more recent times, however, the systems that produce and distribute food have gradually reduced the amount of direct effort required for many individuals to obtain their meals. Crops are grown by farmers often far from the cities where they are eventually consumed. Transportation systems carry these foods across long distances, and markets make them available in ways that require little physical effort from the people who purchase them. For many individuals, the act of obtaining food now involves only a short journey to a store rather than a long search across the landscape. This shift represents one of the most significant changes in the long relationship between humans and nourishment. Yet the biological systems that regulate hunger were shaped during a much earlier period of human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, the human body evolved in environments where food required effort to obtain, and where periods of abundance alternated with quieter intervals when nourishment was less certain. The metabolic processes that govern appetite, energy storage, and hunger signals developed under those conditions. They allowed the body to encourage eating when food was available, and to store energy that could be used later when food became scarce. These systems helped humans survive in landscapes where the timing of nourishment could never be perfectly predicted. Even today, these same biological mechanisms remain active within every person. The sensation of hunger continues to appear when the body's energy reserves decline, guiding attention toward the need for nourishment. This signal evolved in a world where finding food required exploration and effort, yet it still operates within modern environments where food can be obtained far more easily than before. In this sense, The human body carries an ancient pattern of regulation into a modern world that is organized very differently from the environments in which that pattern first developed. Researchers studying human physiology often note that the body's appetite systems respond strongly to the presence of food, particularly foods rich in energy. This response reflects the long evolutionary past in which high-energy foods were valuable resources that could help sustain individuals through uncertain periods. When such foods were discovered in earlier environments, eating them provided an advantage because the energy could be stored for later use. In modern settings where energy-dense foods may be more readily available, the same biological tendencies can continue to encourage eating even when food scarcity is less immediate. These observations do not imply that the human body is poorly designed. Instead, they illustrate how deeply human biology remains connected to the environments in which it evolved. The appetite signals that guide eating today were shaped during a long period when nourishment was difficult to obtain and often uncertain. Within that older world, hunger served as an essential guide directing attention towards survival. In the modern world, where food may arrive through complex systems of production and trade, the body continues to rely on those same signals. This continuity reveals how closely the present remains linked with the deep past of human evolution. Even as technology, agriculture, and global trade reshape how food moves across the planet, the biological experience of hunger still reflects the ancient environments where human life first learned to endure within cycles of abundance, waiting, and search. When we look across the long arc of human history, a quiet pattern begins to emerge. For most of the time that our species has existed, the search for food was not a brief interruption in the day. It was the central activity around which many other aspects of life were organized. Movement across landscapes, the making of tools, the observation of seasons, and the sharing of knowledge all revolved around the effort to obtain nourishment. The body's signals of hunger guided attention toward these tasks, reminding individuals that survival depended on maintaining a steady relationship with the environments that provided food. Even as societies changed from mobile groups of foragers to farming villages, and later to complex cities connected by trade networks, the underlying connection between human life and the need for nourishment remained constant. One of the most remarkable aspects of this long history is how consistently human communities adapted to the changing conditions around them. When food sources were scattered across landscapes, people developed knowledge about plants, animals, and seasonal patterns that helped guide their search. When agriculture emerged, communities learned to cultivate crops and manage the soil and water needed to sustain them. Later, as trade expanded, societies built networks that allowed food to travel across great distances. Each of these transformations represented a creative response to the same enduring challenge: how to ensure that nourishment reached the people who needed it. Yet in every stage of this story, food ultimately remained connected to natural systems that unfolded slowly across time. Crops still required sunlight, fertile soil, and water. Animals still depended on the ecosystems that supported their growth. Even the most complex modern food systems continue to rely on these biological foundations. The movement of food across the world may now involve ships, trucks, and vast storage facilities, but the energy contained within that food still originates from the same processes that have sustained life on Earth for millions of years. In this sense, the long search for nourishment has never truly ended. It has simply taken different forms as human societies develop new ways of organizing their relationship with the environment. The human body itself reflects this continuity with the past. The biological systems that regulate hunger, appetite, and energy storage evolved over many thousands of generations, while humans lived in environments where food was uncertain and often difficult to obtain. These systems helped our ancestors survive by encouraging them to eat when nourishment was available and to conserve energy when it was not. Today, even though many people live within complex food systems that make meals more accessible, the same biological signals continue to guide the body's relationship with food. Hunger still appears as a gentle but persistent reminder that energy is required to sustain life. When viewed from this long perspective, the question of why humans were always hungry begins to take on a deeper meaning. Hunger was not simply a problem waiting to be solved. It was part of the biological guidance system that helped humans navigate environments where nourishment appeared in cycles rather than in constant supply. The sensation encouraged exploration, cooperation, and attention to the landscapes that supported human life. It shaped how communities moved, how they shared resources, and how knowledge about food was passed from one generation to the next. In this way, hunger played a quiet role in shaping the very structure of human societies. Even in the modern world, where food may arrive through systems far removed from the environments where it was produced, the signal of hunger continues to link each individual to this much older story. It reminds us that the human body still carries the memory of landscapes where nourishment had to be discovered, cultivated, or shared. The long history of human hunger therefore reveals not only the challenges our ancestors faced, but also the remarkable adaptability that allowed them to survive within a world where the balance between energy and life was always being carefully maintained. When we continue to follow this long story of nourishment through human history, another quiet realization begins to appear. The experience of hunger was never simply a sign of absence. It was also a signal that kept human attention connected to the world beyond the body. Each time the body asked for food, it directed awareness outward toward the landscapes, seasons, and living systems that made nourishment possible. In the distant past, this connection was visible in daily life. People watched the movement of animals across plains, observed when certain plants ripened, and listened to the subtle changes in weather that signaled the arrival of new seasons. Hunger guided the rhythm of these observations, reminding individuals that survival depended on understanding the environment with patience and care. Over thousands of years, this attentive relationship with the natural world helped humans develop knowledge that was passed carefully from one generation to the next. Children learned which plants were safe to eat, where animals could be found at different times of year, and how the patterns of wind and rain influenced the growth of crops. These lessons were not always written down. Instead, they were carried in memory, shared through stories, and reinforced through daily experience. In this way, the simple biological signal of hunger helped shape entire traditions of knowledge about landscapes and ecosystems. It encouraged communities to observe carefully and to remember what they had learned. Even when agriculture later allowed people to cultivate food in more predictable ways, the deeper connection between nourishment and the environment remained present. Farmers continued to watch the sky for signs of rain, examine the soil for its fertility, and observe how plants responded to changing conditions. Harvests still depended on these subtle interactions between human effort and natural cycles. Hunger, therefore, continued to guide attention toward the balance between people and the land that sustained them. In more recent times, the expansion of modern food systems has created greater distance between many individuals and the environments where food originates. Markets and distribution networks often deliver nourishment in ways that require little direct interaction with fields, rivers, or forests. Yet even in these settings, the deeper relationship has not disappeared. Every meal still carries within it the energy of sunlight captured by plants, the water that nourished those plants, and the soil that supported their growth. These natural elements remain quietly present within every piece of food, even when they are no longer visible to those who consume it. Scientific understanding of ecosystems has made this connection even clearer. Researchers studying agriculture and ecology often emphasize how closely food production remains tied to environmental health. Fertile soils, stable climates, and balanced ecosystems all contribute to the ability of landscapes to produce nourishment. When these systems function well, crops can grow and communities can thrive. When they are disrupted, the effects can influence food production in ways that reach far beyond the fields themselves. These insights remind us that the ancient relationship between hunger and the environment continues to shape human life today. The body's request for nourishment still links each individual to a vast network of ecological processes that operate quietly across the planet. Seen from this perspective, hunger becomes more than a simple biological sensation. It becomes a reminder of the deep interdependence between humans and the living systems that sustain them. For most of our species' existence, people lived in close awareness of this relationship because their survival depended directly on understanding it. Although modern systems have changed how food moves through the world, the underlying connection remains unchanged. The energy that nourishes the human body still begins its journey within the soil, the water, and the sunlight of the earth. Hunger continues to point toward that ancient origin, linking every individual to the long and complex story of how humans learn to live within the rhythms of the natural world. When the long history of human life is viewed from a quiet distance, hunger begins to appear not as a failure of the world, but as one of the signals that guided our species through it. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings lived within landscapes where nourishment could never be assumed. Plants ripened according to seasons. Animals moved across wide territories. Rivers rose and fell with changing weather. In that world, the body's sensation of hunger acted as a steady reminder that life depended on maintaining a relationship with these rhythms. It encouraged movement across the land, observation of subtle environmental signs, and cooperation among members of the community. The feeling itself was often uncomfortable, yet it played a role in directing attention toward the tasks that allowed human life to continue. When people followed animal tracks, searched for edible plants, or waited patiently beside growing crops, hunger quietly shaped the rhythm of their awareness. It helped guide them toward the landscapes that held the energy necessary for survival. Across generations, these experiences gradually formed a deep connection between human communities and the environments that sustained them. Knowledge about seasons, soils, animals, and weather patterns accumulated slowly through observation and memory. Families passed these lessons to their children not as abstract theories, but as practical understanding shaped by daily life. The knowledge of where food might appear and when it could be gathered became part of cultural traditions that helped communities endure through uncertain conditions. Even as agriculture later transformed many aspects of human life, the same careful attention to the land remained essential. Farmers still watched the sky for rain, examined the soil before planting, and waited through the long months of growth before harvest could finally arrive. The body's signals of hunger continued to guide this relationship with patience and awareness. In the modern world, the systems that deliver food have become far more complex. Ships cross oceans carrying grain, trucks move vegetables across continents, and markets display foods that originate in distant landscapes. These networks allow many people to obtain nourishment without ever seeing the fields where their meals began. Yet beneath these modern structures, the deeper processes that create food remain unchanged. Plants still grow through sunlight captured by leaves, water drawn upward from the soil, and nutrients absorbed from the earth. Animals still depend on these plants for their own growth. Every meal continues to carry within it the quiet work of ecosystems operating across forests, fields, rivers, and oceans. The distance between people and the origin of their food may have increased, but the fundamental relationship between human life and the living world has not disappeared. Seen from this perspective, the long history of human hunger reveals something important about the nature of our species. Hunger was never only about scarcity, it was also about connection. It linked the body to the landscapes that provided energy. It encouraged awareness of seasons and environments. It shaped cooperation within communities, as people shared food and knowledge with one another. Through this process, hunger helped guide the development of human societies, quietly influencing how people moved, learned, and organized their lives around the search for nourishment. Even today, when food can often be obtained with little effort compared to the distant past, the sensation of hunger still carries the memory of that earlier world. It reminds the body that energy is required to continue living, just as it did for countless generations before. And behind every meal, no matter how modern its journey may seem, the same ancient processes continue unfolding in the living landscapes of the earth. Soil, water, sunlight, and time still work together to produce the nourishment that sustains human life. So, when we return to the question that began this quiet exploration, why humans were always hungry, the answer may not lie in a single moment of history or a single change in human society. Instead, it appears within the long relationship between our bodies and the environments that sustain them. Hunger was the signal that kept that relationship alive. It guided human attention toward the sources of energy that made survival possible. And even now, after thousands of years of innovation and adaptation, it remains a gentle reminder of the deep connection between human life and the living world that continues to feed it. Perhaps the most interesting question, then, is not why hunger existed in the past, but how much of that ancient relationship with the world still lives quietly within us today.